There's a background detail in the season 15 episode, You're Getting Old, that I don't think enough people talk about. It's easy to miss because so much is happening in the foreground. Stan's world is literally turning to crap. His parents are falling apart. His friendships are dissolving. But if you look at the edges of the frame during that final montage, you'll see something that catches you off guard. The furniture in the Marsh house is already half packed. The walls are bare. And there's this one shot where Stan's bedroom, which has been the same for 14 seasons, this familiar little box we've visited hundreds of times, is just empty. The bed is stripped. The posters are gone. And in that moment, with Fleetwood Mac's Landslide playing underneath, yet you realize that this silly animated show about foul-mouthed children just broke your heart using nothing but negative space and a construction paper bedroom. And that's the thing about South Park that I keep coming back to. The darkness. Not the gross-out stuff. Not the shock value. Not Cartman being Cartman. I mean the real darkness. The kind that sneaks up on you between the fart jokes and the celebrity parodies and the absurdist chaos. The kind that makes you laugh and then makes you sit very still for a moment and wonder what just happened to you. Because here's the thing, South Park has been on the air since August 13th, 1997. That's nearly 3 decades. Over 300 episodes. And in all that time, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have built something that most people still don't fully appreciate. Underneath the crude animation and the offensive humor, and the relentless satirical attacks on everything and everyone, they've built one of the darkest shows in television history. Not dark in the way that prestige dramas are dark, with their muted color palettes and their brooding anti-heroes. Dark in a way that's more honest than that. Dark in a way that sneaks past your defenses because you're too busy laughing to notice. So tonight, we're going deep. We're going into the places this show has taken us that we didn't expect. The moments where the comedy dropped away and left something raw and uncomfortable underneath. The episodes that crossed lines nobody even knew existed. The production decisions that changed everything. The characters whose suffering stopped being funny and started being something else entirely. Then the banned episodes you literally cannot watch anymore. The moments where Trey Parker and Matt Stone stopped being comedians and started being something closer to philosophers, or psychologists, or just 2 guys from Colorado who understand something fundamental about human cruelty that the rest of us would rather not think about. This is 3 hours of the darkest South Park facts to fall asleep to. And I know that sounds like a contradiction. Darkness and sleep don't usually go together, but I think there's something comforting about sitting with the difficult parts of something you love, about acknowledging that the show that made you laugh harder than anything else has also, quietly, been one of the most unflinching examinations of human nature on television. So if you're watching this late at night, get comfortable, grab a blanket, get your pillow right, and settle in. We're going to be here for a while. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps us keep making these, and I appreciate every single one of you who does. Okay, let's start with something small, something most people walk right past. You know what struck me the first time I really paid attention to South Park's visual design? Not the animation itself. Everyone talks about the construction paper thing, the cutout look, the deliberate crudeness. I mean the faces. Specifically, I mean what happens to the faces when something genuinely dark is happening. Because South Park characters have the simplest faces in all of animation. 2 dots for eyes, a line for a mouth, maybe some eyebrows if the scene calls for it. That's it. There's almost nothing there to work with. And yet, and this is what kills me, somehow those tiny adjustments, those barely perceptible shifts in the position of 2 dots and a line can communicate the most devastating emotions you've ever seen on screen. Think about the look on Stan's face at the end of You're Getting Old. Season 15, Episode 7, aired June 8th, 2011. It's his birthday. He's just turned 10, and over the course of 22 minutes, everything in his life has collapsed. His friends have abandoned him. His parents have separated. His entire perception of reality has shifted so that everything, music, movies, food, conversation, sounds and looks and tastes like actual excrement. It's the show's most literal metaphor. Growing up means the world turns to crap. And in the final shot, Stan is lying on a bare mattress in an unfamiliar apartment, staring at the ceiling, and his face is just nothing. 2 dots, a line. But somehow you know exactly what that kid is feeling. Somehow that empty little face contains the entirety of what it means to wake up one morning and realize that nothing makes you happy anymore. I've watched that episode probably 20 times now, and I still don't fully understand how they pull it off. It shouldn't work. The animation is intentionally primitive. These characters look like paper dolls. And yet Trey Parker and Matt Stone consistently use those limitations to create moments of genuine emotional devastation that shows with 10 times the animation budget can't match. And I think that's the key to understanding why South Park's darkest moments hit so hard. It's not despite the crude animation, it's because of it. When something truly horrible happens on this show, and truly horrible things happen on this show all the time, there's nowhere to hide. There's no cinematic lighting to aestheticize the violence. There's no sweeping score to tell you how to feel. There's no realistic facial animation to soften the blow with relatable human expressions. There's just the raw thing, presented in the most artless possible way, and your brain has to do all the emotional work itself. That's a trick. That's a deliberate artistic choice, and it makes South Park's darkness land differently than anything else on television. Okay, so let's talk about where this darkness actually comes from, because it didn't start with the show. It started with two guys in Colorado who had a very specific understanding of comedy from a very young age. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met at the University of Colorado Boulder in 1992. They were both film students, both obsessed with comedy, both drawn to the kind of humor that made other people uncomfortable. The story of how South Park came to be has been told a million times. The construction paper short, The Spirit of Christmas, in 1995, the viral spread through VHS tapes, and early internet sharing, the call from Comedy Central. But what doesn't get talked about enough is the specific brand of comedy that Parker and Stone were drawn to before South Park existed. They weren't just crude. They weren't just offensive. They were fascinated by the gap between how people present themselves and who they actually are. They were drawn to hypocrisy, to self-deception, to the elaborate lies societies tell themselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. And that, right there, is where South Park's real darkness lives. Not in the gore, not in the shock value, in the gap between what we say and what we do, in the distance between how we see ourselves and who we actually are. The show premiered on Comedy Central on August 13th, 1997. The very first episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, is mostly remembered for its juvenile humor, aliens, anal probes, the debut of the four boys. But even in that first episode, there's something darker underneath. There's a casual cruelty to how the adults in South Park treat the children. There's a fundamental indifference. The kids are left to fend for themselves in a world that simply doesn't care about them. And that theme, the abandonment of children by the adults who are supposed to protect them, would become one of the show's most persistent and most devastating threads. I mean, think about it. Think about the parents in South Park. Randy Marsh is a narcissistic man-child who treats his family like supporting characters in the movie of his own life. Sharon Marsh is exhausted and ignored. Gerald and Sheila Broflovsky swing between smothering overprotection and complete obliviousness. Stuart and Carol McCormick are alcoholics living in poverty who can barely keep their children alive. And Stephen and Linda Stotch, Butters' parents, are something else entirely. Something we need to talk about for a while. Because Butters Stotch might be the darkest character in South Park, and I don't think people fully reckon with that. He's presented as the innocent one, the naive one, the sweet kid who always gets dragged into everyone else's schemes. But if you actually track what happens to Butters across the show's entire run, what you're looking at is a comprehensive portrait of child abuse. And not the kind of child abuse that gets a very special episode treatment. The kind that's so normalized, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that nobody, not the characters, not the audience, even registers it as abuse most of the time. Let's go back to Butters' very own episode. Season 5, Episode 14, aired December 12th, 2001. This was the episode that officially introduced Butters as a major character. Kenny had just been killed off permanently in Kenny Dies. Season 5, Episode 13, December 5th, 2001. And the creators needed someone to fill the gap. So they gave Butters his spotlight episode. And what did they do with it? They had his mother try to drown him. That's not hyperbole. That's the plot of the episode. Butters follows his dad to what turns out to be a series of adult establishments, discovers that his father is living a secret life, and when Linda Stotch finds out about her husband's activities, she snaps. She drives Butters to a lake and pushes the car into the water with him inside. She tries to murder her own child, and when Butters miraculously survives, she and Steven lie to the press and claim he was kidnapped. They exploit their own attempted murder of their child to get sympathy from the media. And here's the thing that gets me. The show plays this for comedy. It's funny. The way Butters is oblivious to the danger, the way the parents' deception spirals, the Gary Condit and O.J. Simpson references, it's genuinely funny. And that's what makes it so dark, because the comedy doesn't cancel out the horror. It exists alongside it. You're laughing at the same time that you're watching a child narrowly survive being murdered by his own mother. And the show never asks you to choose between those two responses. It just lets both of them sit there, side by side, and trusts you to deal with it. That's a Trey Parker and Matt Stone move. That's their fundamental approach to darkness. They don't dramatize it. They don't underline it. They just present it inside the same comedic framework as everything else and let the audience figure out how they feel. And that approach has produced some of the most genuinely unsettling television I've ever watched. Let me stay with this thought for a moment and expand it, because I think there's something specific about how South Park treats its female characters that adds another layer of darkness that doesn't get discussed enough. Wendy Testaberger, Stan's on-again, off-again girlfriend, the smartest kid in the class, the one who actually cares about politics, about justice, about the world beyond South Park. And the show has consistently, over decades, used Wendy to make points about how society treats women who speak up, and then pushed her back to the margins. In Breast Cancer Show Ever, Season 12, Episode 9, aired October 15, 2008. Wendy challenges Cartman to a fight after he repeatedly mocks breast cancer awareness. Then the entire episode builds toward this confrontation, and when it finally happens, Wendy beats the absolute hell out of Cartman. It's visceral, it's satisfying. It's one of the most cathartic moments in the show's history. But here's the dark part. After that episode, Wendy goes back to being a background character. She had her moment. She proved her point, and then the show moved on without her. The structure of South Park, with its 4 male leads, and its 6-day production cycle, and its tendency to default to the same character dynamics, means that Wendy's victories are always temporary. She wins the battle and loses the war, over and over, because the show's machinery isn't built to sustain female characters as leads. And you can see this pattern across the show's treatment of women more broadly. Then Sharon Marsh gets 1 episode a season, where her frustration boils over, and the show acknowledges that she's been right about everything all along. And then she goes back to being Randy's wife. The girls at school occasionally get spotlight episodes that explore their social dynamics. The List, Stupid Spoiled Whore Video Playset, the Heidi Turner arc. But these episodes always feel like detours from the main road, rather than destinations in their own right. I don't think Parker and Stone are misogynistic. I think they're 2 men who write what they know, and what they know is the experience of being boys and men. But the result is that South Park's female characters exist primarily in relation to male characters, and that structural imbalance is, itself, a form of darkness, a quiet statement about whose stories matter and whose don't. The Heidi Turner arc in seasons 20 and 21 is actually one of the most interesting things the show has done with a female character, and it's dark as hell. Heidi, who starts as a sweet, intelligent girl, enters a relationship with Cartman and gradually loses herself. She becomes meaner. She becomes more like him. She gains weight, the show's visual shorthand for moral corruption, which is its own problematic choice. And by the end of the arc, she's almost unrecognizable. It's a portrait of an abusive relationship that's uncomfortably accurate. The way Cartman manipulates Heidi, the way he isolates her from her friends, the way he makes her feel like she can't survive without him. It tracks with real patterns of emotional abuse. And the show takes its time with this storyline, letting it play out across multiple episodes, showing the slow erosion of Heidi's identity in a way that's genuinely painful to watch. But what makes it dark, what makes it darkest, is how it resolves. Heidi eventually breaks free. She returns to herself. She leaves Cartman, and the show treats this as a victory. But the damage has been done. The audience has spent 2 seasons watching an innocent character be systematically broken by a sociopath. And while the show acknowledges that this was wrong, it also provided Cartman with no meaningful consequences. He just moves on to his next obsession. The abuser walks away. The victim has to rebuild. And the show, characteristically, doesn't linger on the rebuilding. That's realistic, honestly. That's how it works in real life. Abusers rarely face consequences proportionate to the damage they cause. Victims are left to pick up the pieces alone, and the world moves on. But watching it happen to a cartoon character, watching the pattern play out in a show that's supposed to be a comedy, hits differently than watching it in a drama, because the comedy doesn't provide distance. It doesn't let you process the abuse from a safe remove. You're laughing 1 minute, and watching psychological destruction the next. And the whiplash between those 2 states is itself a form of violence. And I've rewatched those episodes 3 or 4 times now, and every time I notice something new in Heidi's face, in her expressions, in the way her dot eyes and line mouth convey resignation, then numbness, then a terrible kind of adaptation. That the simplest possible animation expressing the most complex possible emotional deterioration. That's the South Park trick again. The crude aesthetic forces your imagination to fill in the gaps, and your imagination is crueler than any animator could be. Let me take a detour here and talk about something I don't think anyone has discussed in quite this way before. The geography of darkness in South Park. Not the fictional town's geography, though that's interesting too, but the way the show distributes its darkness across different locations and spaces. Think about where the darkest things happen. Cartman's house, where he plots and schemes, and where his enabling mother Leanne lives in her own world of denial. The school, where shootings go unnoticed, and counselors fail, and teachers are more broken than their students. The Stotch household, where Butters is grounded, beaten, and nearly murdered. The McCormick house, a crumbling structure on the wrong side of the tracks where poverty and addiction define daily life. The forest, where satanic woodland creatures perform blood orgies. But also think about the spaces that should be safe and aren't. The hospital, where botched procedures give children AIDS, and where Kenny's terminal illness plays out in empty rooms. The church, where Father Maxie tries to be moral in a system that protects predators. The bus stop, where the boys stand every morning, 4 small figures against a snowy landscape, waiting for a bus to take them to a school where bullets fly through hallways. That bus stop image is one of the most iconic in television. 4 kids, snow, mountains, waiting. And if you've been watching the show for long enough, you know what's coming. You know something horrible is about to happen. The bus stop is the calm before every storm. It's the last moment of peace before the episode begins. And the fact that even that moment, that brief, static, innocent moment of children waiting for school, is charged with the knowledge of impending chaos. That's the show's fundamental darkness distilled into a single recurring image. I also want to talk about something specific regarding the show's approach to suicide and self-harm, because this is an area where the show's irreverence has sometimes collided painfully with reality. South Park has depicted suicide and attempted suicide multiple times. Britney Spears in Britney's New Look. Tweak's anxiety spirals that border on self-destruction. Butters' mother's murder-suicide attempt. The Margarine episode, where Butters fakes his own death. And in most cases, the show handles these topics with the kind of dark comedy that South Park is known for, acknowledging the darkness without wallowing in it, using humor to create a space for discussion rather than despair. But there's one element that complicates this. The show has, at various points, used suicide as a punchline in ways that don't quite earn the darkness they're invoking. Characters casually reference killing themselves. Self-harm is occasionally played for shock value without sufficient context. And while I understand that South Park's philosophy is that everything is fair game for comedy, that the alternative, treating certain topics as sacrosanct, that leads to the kind of moral policing the show was created to oppose. I also think there's a difference between using dark comedy to illuminate a difficult topic and using it to dismiss one. The show has gotten better at this over time. Put It Down, Season 21, Episode 2, handled suicide prevention with a sensitivity that surprised many longtime viewers. The episode featured Craig helping Tweak through a genuine anxiety crisis, and the show's portrayal of that support, patient, specific, grounded in real therapeutic techniques, was miles away from the casual darkness of earlier seasons. It was as if the show had looked at its own history with the topic and decided that growth was possible, that you could be South Park, crude, offensive, irreverent, and still treat mental health with care when the moment demanded it. And that evolution is important because it demonstrates something that the show's critics often miss. South Park is not static. It's not the same show it was in 1997 or 2005 or 2012. It grows, it changes, it makes mistakes and sometimes corrects them. And the arc of that growth, from casual irreverence to something more nuanced and considered, is, in its own way, a hopeful story. A show that started by mocking everything equally has learned, over 3 decades, that some things deserve a lighter touch. Not silence, not censorship, just care. Just the recognition that you can be honest about darkness without being careless with it. And I think that's where we are now. In 2026, South Park is a show that contains multitudes. It contains the blood orgies and the Fleetwood Mac montages. Then the school shootings played for dark comedy, and the anxiety attacks played for genuine empathy. The fart jokes and the philosophical questions. The construction paper simplicity and the emotional complexity. It contains everything it's ever been. Every mistake, every triumph, every line crossed, and every lesson learned. And it carries all of it forward into whatever comes next. The question is whether the darkness will deepen or whether it will transform into something else. Whether the show will continue to find new shadows to explore, or whether it will begin to seek the light. Whether Parker and Stone, now in their 50s, making a show they started in their 20s, will continue to be angry at the world, or whether they'll begin to make peace with it. I don't know the answer, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Part of what makes South Park compelling is the uncertainty, the not knowing, the sense that anything could happen, that the next episode could be the most brilliant, or the most offensive, or the most tender, or the most cruel thing the show has ever produced. That unpredictability is a form of aliveness. It's the beating heart of a show that has somehow remained vital for nearly 30 years in a medium where most shows don't survive 5. And that aliveness, that refusal to settle, to coast, to repeat itself, is maybe the most remarkable thing about South Park. More remarkable than its darkness, more remarkable than its comedy, more remarkable than its controversies, or its censorship battles, or its billion-dollar deals. The fact that it's still alive, the fact that it's still trying, the fact that 2 guys from Colorado are still sitting in a studio in Los Angeles, pulling all-nighters, arguing about whether a joke works, racing against a clock that never stops, pouring themselves into a 22-minute cartoon that they have to finish by Wednesday morning, or it doesn't exist. That's not dark. That's something else entirely. That's devotion. That's love, actually. A very strange, very stressful, very profane form of love, but love nonetheless. Butters' abuse doesn't stop with that episode either. It continues throughout the entire series. His parents ground him for the most absurd and unfair reasons. His grandmother bullies him mercilessly in Butterballs, Season 16, Episode 5, which aired on April 11th, 2012. He's repeatedly manipulated by Cartman into participating in dangerous and degrading schemes. And he's sent to a conversion camp in Cartman Sucks, Season 11, Episode 2, March 14th, 2007, because his parents misinterpret a humiliating photo. And through all of it, Butters remains fundamentally kind, fundamentally trusting, fundamentally hopeful. And honestly, that might be the darkest thing about him. Not the abuse itself, but the fact that it doesn't change who he is. Because in the real world, that kind of sustained abuse almost always changes who a person is. It warps them. It breaks something fundamental. But Butters just keeps going. He keeps being sweet. He keeps trusting people. And you can read that 2 ways. You can read it as resilience, as this beautiful, unbreakable spirit that refuses to let the world make him bitter. Or you can read it as something much sadder, as a child so thoroughly conditioned by abuse that he doesn't even recognize it as abuse. He doesn't fight back because he doesn't know he's supposed to. And I think the show, to its credit, never tells you which reading is correct. It leaves both possibilities open, and that ambiguity is what makes Butters one of the most genuinely tragic figures in animated television. I need to sit with that for a second before we move on, because I think the Butters thing is important to understanding what South Park does differently from every other show that tries to be dark. South Park doesn't use darkness as a gimmick. It doesn't deploy shock value and then move on. It builds structures of darkness over years, over decades, and lets the weight accumulate slowly, almost imperceptibly, until you look back and realize that this character you've been laughing at for 25 years has actually been living through something genuinely horrifying. And the show never once stopped to ask for your sympathy. It just let the facts speak for themselves. And you know what? While we're on the subject of Butters and the adults in South Park failing the children around them, let me take us to another episode that I think deserves way more discussion than it gets. Cartman Joins Nambla, Season 4, Episode 5, aired June 21st, 2000. Written by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, directed by Eric Stowe. This episode is a lot. Even by South Park standards, this one makes you sit up straight. The premise is that Cartman, frustrated with what he considers the immaturity of his friends, goes online to find older, more mature companions. And because Cartman is Cartman, because he has absolutely zero awareness of what's happening around him, he ends up in chat rooms populated by predators. He meets with men who give him candy and books and back rubs. Men who want to be his friend. And he doesn't understand. He genuinely doesn't understand what's happening because nobody has taught him. Nobody has protected him. Nobody is watching. And here's the thing, it aired in the year 2000. The internet was still relatively young. Online predation was not the well-discussed danger it is today. And South Park walked right into that space and made an episode about child predators targeting kids online that was, underneath all the absurdity, genuinely terrifying in its accuracy. Cartman enters a chat room, types his age, and is immediately inundated with messages from grown men. That happens. That really happens. And the show showed it happening to a 10-year-old, played it for comedy, and somehow made the comedy sharpen the horror rather than dull it. Cartman ends up becoming the poster boy for NAMBLA, the North American Man/Boy Love Association, which is, horrifyingly, a real organization. The episode climaxes with a hotel chase scene set to cheerful French music, where the boys flee from naked predators through hallways. Butters is offered up by Cartman as a sacrifice. Cartman literally suggests letting the predators have Butters so the rest of them can escape. And Stuart McCormick, Kenny's father, stumbles into a room full of NAMBLA members who mistake him for a child and assault him. IGN listed this episode as number 7 on their list of 10 favorite South Park episodes in 2006. British satellite channel Sky One banned it entirely. And at the end, when the NAMBLA leader gives a speech trying to frame child molestation as a form of oppressed love, trying to use the language of civil rights to justify the exploitation of children, Stan and Kyle shut him down. They say that while they believe in tolerance and acceptance, some things are just wrong, period. Children should never have to endure what these men are doing. That moment, Kyle and Stan standing up and saying flatly that this is wrong and nothing will ever make it not wrong, is one of the show's moral anchors. It's one of those rare moments where South Park drops the irony and the both sidesism and simply states a truth. And the fact that it happens in an episode about child predators tells you everything about how this show operates. That the comedy isn't a shield against the darkness, it's a vehicle for it. I think about the B-plot of that episode too. Kenny's parents are expecting another baby, and Kenny, terrified of being replaced, of losing what little he has, spends the entire episode trying to prevent the pregnancy. He takes his parents on a ride called the John Denver Experience, named after the singer who died in a plane crash, hoping the violence will cause a miscarriage. It's presented as slapstick, but underneath there's this incredibly sad portrait of a poor kid who knows that another mouth to feed in his family will push them even further into crisis. And the episode ends with Kenny being run over by an ambulance. His new little brother is born wearing a tiny orange parka. Life goes on. Nothing changes. The cycle repeats. Right, so let me talk about something that connects all of these dark episodes together. And it's something I've been circling around for a while without naming it directly. South Park is, fundamentally, a show about children living in a world that has failed them. I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean it literally. The adults in South Park are, almost without exception, incompetent, selfish, dangerous, or absent. The teachers don't teach. The counselors don't counsel. The parents don't parent. The police don't protect. The institutions that are supposed to safeguard childhood are consistently shown to be broken, corrupt, or indifferent, and the children are left to navigate this failed world on their own, armed with nothing but their friendships and their instincts. This isn't subtext. This is text. Think about the recurring structure of almost every South Park episode. Something insane happens in the adult world. The kids get caught up in it, and by the end, it's usually Stan or Kyle who has to deliver the moral lesson that the adults should have known all along. The children are wiser than their parents. The children are more compassionate than their teachers. The children are more courageous than their leaders. And that inversion, children being forced to be the adults in a world where the adults have abdicated responsibility, is one of the darkest things about the show. Think about how many South Park episodes end with a child saying something like, "You know, I've learned something today." That phrase has become a running joke, a formulaic ending the show both uses and mocks. But the formula reveals something important. The fact that the children are the ones doing the learning, the ones synthesizing the lesson, means that nobody else is doing it for them. Nobody is teaching them. Nobody is guiding them. They're figuring it out alone. And the sadness underneath that catchphrase, the quiet tragedy of a child who has to articulate wisdom that no adult will provide, has been running through South Park since the very first episode. I want to linger on this because I think it's the key to understanding the show's deepest darkness. Parker has said in interviews, and I'm paraphrasing here, not quoting, that when he and Matt were growing up in Colorado, they felt like the adults around them were full of it. Not evil, not deliberately harmful, just wrong. And South Park was, from the beginning, an attempt to express that feeling. The feeling of being a kid who sees through the adults around him. The feeling of realizing, at a very young age, that the people in charge don't actually know what they're doing. South Park takes that common childhood revelation and dramatizes the consequences. What happens when the adults really don't know what they're doing? Kids get hurt. Kids get abandoned. Kids get abused. Kids get shot in school, and nobody cares. Kids grow up thinking the world is crap, because in their experience, it is. The show never states this thesis directly. It never has a character stand up and say, the adults have failed us. It just shows it, episode after episode, season after season, for nearly 30 years. And the accumulation of that evidence, a steady build of a case against adult society, is one of the most devastating things on television. Let me bring that thread to a specific episode that crystallizes this theme perfectly. The Death Camp of Tolerance, Season 6, Episode 14, aired November 20th, 2002. This is the one where Mr. Garrison, trying to get fired so he can sue the school for discrimination, behaves in increasingly outrageous ways in the classroom. He inserts his teaching assistant, Mr. Slave, into, look, I don't need to describe it. The point is that Garrison is deliberately being as provocative as possible, hoping the school will fire him for being openly gay so he can collect a settlement. But the school doesn't fire him. Instead, when the children try to report his behavior, when they go to their parents and say, something is really wrong in our classroom, they're punished. They're sent to a tolerance camp, a re-education facility modeled after a concentration camp, complete with black and white cinematography reminiscent of Schindler's List. The message is clear. If you complain about what an adult is doing, you're the problem. You're intolerant. You need to be fixed. And the children are right. What's happening in their classroom is wrong. Mr. Garrison's behavior is inappropriate by any standard. But because the adults have conflated tolerance with acceptance, because they can't distinguish between accepting someone's identity and accepting inappropriate behavior, the children's legitimate concerns are dismissed as bigotry. That's an incredibly sophisticated point, delivered through the most absurd possible scenario. But underneath, the message is real, and it's dark. Children's voices don't matter. When a child says something is wrong, the adult world's first instinct is to assume the child is the problem, not the adult, not the institution, the child. And that reflexive dismissal of children's testimony is at the root of almost every system of abuse in the real world. And then there's the visual language of it. The tolerance camp looks like a death camp. The children wear striped uniforms. The counselors bark orders. The barbed wire fences close in. It's an incredibly provocative visual, comparing re-education programs to concentration camps. But it works because the show earns it. The children have done nothing wrong, and they reported inappropriate behavior and were punished for it. The system that was supposed to protect them was weaponized against them. And the concentration camp imagery, however extreme, communicates the helplessness that children feel when the adults around them become the threat. That's something South Park does better than almost any other show. It uses extreme imagery to communicate real emotional truths. You might think the comparison is tasteless, and honestly, it kind of is, but the underlying feeling is genuine. The feeling of being a child who knows something is wrong and can't get anyone to listen. The feeling of being punished for telling the truth. That's real. That's happened to real kids. And South Park finds a way to express it that, despite its crudity, lands with genuine emotional force. Alright, let's shift gears, because if we're talking about the darkest facts about South Park, we need to talk about the episode that changed everything. The one that took a bratty, foul-mouthed fat kid and turned him into one of the most genuinely terrifying characters in fiction. Scott Tenorman Must Die. Season 5, Episode 4. First aired July 11th, 2001, the 69th episode of the series overall. Written and directed by Trey Parker. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know this episode. You know what happens. But I want to talk about something that most people don't discuss, which is how this episode fundamentally altered not just Cartman as a character, but the entire show's relationship with darkness. Here's the setup. A 9th grader named Scott Tenorman sells Cartman his pubic hair for $10, convincing the gullible kid that buying pubes equals reaching puberty. When Stan and Kyle explain that you have to grow your own, Cartman demands his money back. Scott refuses. What follows is an escalating war between the two. Cartman tries increasingly elaborate schemes to recover his $16.12, and Scott humiliates him at every turn. Scott burns Cartman's money in front of him. Scott gets the entire town to laugh at a video of Cartman begging like a pig. And at this point, something shifts. You can feel it. The episode changes temperature. Cartman invites Scott to a chili cook-off, and in the final minutes of the episode, Cartman reveals what he's done. He invited Radiohead, Scott's favorite band, to come to South Park. He manipulated events so that Scott's parents would trespass on a ranch where they were shot by the farmer. He took their bodies, he ground them into meat, he cooked them into chili, and he fed them to Scott. The voice actor Toby Morton provided Scott's screams. Radiohead shows up and calls the crying Scott a crybaby. Cartman licks Scott's tears off his face. The episode ends. I remember the first time I saw this. I think most people remember, because it wasn't just shocking. Plenty of things are shocking. It was the precision that got me, the planning. Cartman didn't just lash out in rage. He constructed a multi-layered scheme that accounted for every variable, that anticipated his friend's betrayal and incorporated it into the plan, that used an actual rock band as a prop in his psychopathic revenge fantasy. That this wasn't a kid having a tantrum. This was a genuine sociopath revealing himself for the first time. And here's a production detail that makes this even more unsettling. Trey Parker and Matt Stone said in interviews that this episode was made specifically to show how evil Eric Cartman could be. They'd been building the character for 4 seasons, establishing him as selfish and bigoted and obnoxious, but they hadn't yet shown what he was truly capable of. Scott to Norman must die was the reveal, the mask coming off, and once it came off, it couldn't go back on. The episode had a production code of 501, meaning it was originally intended as the first episode of Season 5. Writing began in mid-May 2001, more than a month before the season premiere on June 20th. That's significant, because most South Park episodes are created in 6 days. This one took weeks. Parker and Stone knew they were making something important. They knew this episode would change the show, and it did. After Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman's characterization shifted permanently. He went from a bratty kid to a genuine monster. The episodes that followed, over the next 20+ years, would see him commit increasingly horrific acts, but they all trace back to this moment. This was the proof of concept. This was the show saying, this character is not just mean. He is evil, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But here's what I find fascinating, and this is where it gets really dark. In Season 14, Episode 6, 201, which aired on April 21st, 2010, we learn something that recontextualizes the entire Chili Con Carne incident. Scott Tenorman returns as the leader of the Ginger Separatist movement, and he reveals that his father, Jack Tenorman, was actually a Denver Broncos player who had an affair with Leanne Cartman. Jack Tenorman was Eric Cartman's biological father, which means Cartman murdered his own father, ground him up, and fed him to his own half-brother. And this wasn't a retcon. Parker and Stone say they had this in mind from the beginning, or at least from early in the planning of Season 14. They sat on that revelation for 9 years. 9 years of knowing that Cartman had killed his own father and watching him go through life without ever learning the truth. And when he does learn the truth in 201, his reaction isn't horror, it isn't guilt. And his reaction is dismay, that he's half ginger. That's the darkest thing South Park has ever done with a character. Not the act itself, but the reaction. The complete absence of remorse. The refusal to engage with the moral weight of what he's done. And the show frames it as comedy. It's played for laughs. But underneath, if you sit with it for even a moment, it's devastating. Because what Cartman is really showing us is what happens when cruelty goes completely unchecked, when there are no consequences, when nobody cares enough to stop you. You don't become a villain, you become something worse. You become someone who doesn't even understand what villainy means. And this raises something I want to spend some time on, the relationship between Cartman and Kyle, because it's one of the most psychologically dark dynamics in any television show, animated or otherwise. On the surface, it's a simple conflict. Cartman is the bully, Kyle is the target. Cartman is anti-Semitic, Kyle is Jewish. Cartman is selfish, Kyle is moral. They're foils. It's simple, except it's not simple at all. If you track their relationship across 30 years, what emerges is something more disturbing than a bully-victim dynamic. It's a relationship of mutual dependence. Cartman needs Kyle because Kyle's outrage gives Cartman's provocations meaning. And Kyle needs Cartman because Cartman's evil gives Kyle's morality purpose. Without each other, neither character has a function. They're locked in a cycle of abuse that neither can break because both are getting something from it. The show knows this. Kyle has been called out multiple times for engaging with Cartman when he should walk away. Stan has asked Kyle why he keeps arguing with someone who will never change. And Kyle can never answer satisfactorily, because the honest answer, because fighting Cartman is who I am, and without him I don't know what I am, is too dark to say out loud. Tonsil Trouble, Season 12, Episode 1, aired March 12, 2008, is maybe the clearest expression of how twisted this dynamic has become. Cartman contracts HIV through a botched blood transfusion during a tonsillectomy. Kyle laughs. He can't help it. After years of Cartman's cruelty, years of anti-Semitic abuse, Kyle finds it funny that karma has caught up. He laughs at Cartman having a terminal disease. And then Cartman retaliates. He sneaks into Kyle's house with Butter's help. He draws his own HIV-infected blood and drips it into Kyle's mouth while he sleeps. He deliberately infects Kyle with AIDS as revenge for laughing. Think about that. Cartman infects his classmate with a deadly disease because the classmate laughed at him. That's not a cartoon prank. That's biological warfare against a child. And the school's response? The principal makes Cartman apologize, and then makes Kyle apologize for tattling. That scene, the principal treating the deliberate infection of a child with HIV as a schoolyard spat, might be the most devastating indictment of institutional failure in the entire series. The system designed to protect children instead fails them. The adults can't even recognize the severity of what's happened, and the children are left to deal with it themselves. Then the episode ends with Kyle and Cartman finding a cure for AIDS. The injection of large amounts of money, a typically sharp metaphor about how healthcare works in America, and being celebrated as heroes. Kyle tries to tell everyone that Cartman was the one who infected him. Nobody listens. Nobody cares. The audience cheers. Cartman claims they're even, and Kyle, still furious, still violated, tells Cartman he's going to break his Xbox anyway, because that's all the justice he'll ever get. I think about this dynamic a lot, because it's not just comedic. It's a portrait of something real, the way abusive relationships persist, because both parties develop a dependence on the dynamic. The way victims become entangled with their abusers in ways outsiders can't understand. That the way institutions fail to intervene, because the abuse is so normalized, it doesn't register, and the show never resolves it. Decades later, Cartman and Kyle are still locked in the same cycle, still provoking, still engaging, still hurting each other. And the fact that the show refuses to break the pattern is, itself, a kind of darkness. It's saying that some patterns can't be broken, that some wounds don't heal, that some relationships are prisons made of habit and need, and a strange toxic form of something that isn't quite love, but isn't quite hate either. Alright, let me shift the texture. Let me talk about something that's dark in a different way. Dark in its implications about the real world. Let's talk about Dead Kids. Season 22, Episode 1, aired September 26th, 2018, the season premiere. And I think this might be the most important episode South Park has ever made, even though it's not the most dramatic, or the most shocking, or even, honestly, the funniest. What it is the most painfully accurate. The episode opens in Mrs. Nelson's classroom. She's handing back math tests. Cartman is angry because he copied off Tolkien Black's paper and still failed. And then, in the background, a school shooting begins. Bullets are flying. A SWAT team storms the classroom, and nobody reacts. The teacher keeps teaching. The kids keep complaining about their grades. The shooting is treated as a minor inconvenience, like a fire drill or a rainy day recess. And that's the joke. That's the entire joke. School shootings have become so common that they're background noise. Children dying is a scheduling inconvenience. And the only person in all of South Park who finds this horrifying, Sharon Marsh, is dismissed by everyone around her as overreacting. Randy thinks she's on her period. The other parents think she's being dramatic. The show reduces the only rational, compassionate response to children being murdered to a hormonal mood swing. I've talked to people who said this episode made them angrier than any other episode of South Park. Not at the show, at themselves. Because they realized, watching it, that the satire was accurate, that they had become desensitized, that somewhere along the way, they had started treating school shootings the way the residents of South Park treat them in this episode, as something terrible that happens over there, to other people's kids. And isn't that sad? But what can you do? Pass the potatoes. And the ending. God, the ending. Stan gets shot. He's in the hospital, and Sharon, who has spent the entire episode screaming and crying and begging people to care, picks up the phone, hears that her son has been shot, and says, "Well, I guess it's not the end of the world. She's been broken. She's been worn down. She's joined the rest of them." And Randy looks at her with this relieved expression, like everything is finally normal again. The episode was watched by about 1.09 million viewers on its initial broadcast. Comedy Central had promoted the season with a mock #CancelSouthPark campaign. And I think the dissonance of that, using a cancellation joke to promote a season that opens with the desensitization to child murder, tells you everything about where South Park sits in the cultural landscape. And it exists in that uncomfortable space between comedy and truth, where the only way to say what needs to be said is to say it through a show that everyone assumes is just a cartoon. Let me tell you something about how South Park gets made, because the production process itself is one of the darkest, or at least most intense, stories in television history. Most animated shows take months to produce a single episode. The Simpsons has a production cycle of 6 to 8 months per episode. Family Guy takes roughly 9 months. South Park does it in 6 days. 6 days. From blank page to broadcast. That's not an exaggeration, and it's not a simplified version of a more complicated truth. That is literally how it works. On Thursday, Trey Parker sits down with the writers, and by the writers, I mean a very small team that has included people like Bill Hader and Vernon Chapman over the years, and they start pitching ideas. By Friday, there's a rough concept. Over the weekend, the script starts to take shape, while the animators begin working with placeholder elements. By Monday, the script is still being written, while the animation is being completed simultaneously. On Tuesday, less than 24 hours before air, the team pulls an all-nighter. The episode is typically finished at around 7 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the day it airs, and supervising producer Frank C. Agnoni II takes the master tape to an uplink facility, where it's beamed to Comedy Central in New York just hours before broadcast. And this was documented in the 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, The Making of South Park, directed by Arthur Bradford, which premiered on Comedy Central on October 9th, 2011. The film was nominated for an Emmy Award in the Outstanding Nonfiction Special category, and watching it is a genuinely stressful experience. Not because anything dangerous happens, but because you can see the toll it takes. You can see Trey Parker, who is the driving creative force behind almost every episode, physically deteriorating over the course of the week. He stops sleeping. He stops eating properly. He second guesses every decision. He has moments of genuine creative despair, where he's convinced the episode isn't working, and there's no time to fix it. And he does this every single week when the show is in production, for nearly 30 years. I think about that a lot when I watch the darker episodes, because there's a direct line between the intensity of the production process and the raw, unfiltered quality of the show's darkness. When you have 6 days to make an episode, you don't have time for subtlety committees. You don't have time for focus groups or sensitivity reads. You have time for the first, most honest, most instinctive version of the idea. And sometimes that instinct goes to places that a more considered process would sand down or soften or avoid entirely. The 6-day cycle also means that the show can respond to real-world events almost in real time. When something happens in the news on a Monday, there can be a South Park episode about it by Wednesday. And that speed creates a darkness of its own, a rawness that comes from processing tragedy through comedy before anyone has had time to develop the appropriate distance. South Park doesn't wait for the wound to heal before poking at it. It pokes while the wound is still fresh. And sometimes that's brilliant, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it's both at the same time. But here's what I think is the darkest aspect of the production process, and it's something that doesn't get discussed enough: the cost to the people who make the show. Not just Parker and Stone, but the entire team. The animators who pull all-nighters every single week. The producers who somehow keep this impossible machine running. The voice actors, primarily Parker and Stone themselves, but who voice the vast majority of the characters, who have to sit in a booth and perform some of the most offensive, disturbing, emotionally devastating material on television, week after week, for decades. There's a moment in 6 Days to Air where you can see the exhaustion on Trey Parker's face, and it's the same exhaustion that Stan Marsh wears in You're Getting Old. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Parker has talked about how that episode, the cynicism, the depression, the feeling that everything has turned to crap, was directly inspired by his and Matt Stone's own feelings about the show at that point. After 15 seasons, they were tired. They were creatively drained. They wondered if they had anything left to say, and they expressed that by making one of the saddest episodes of television I've ever seen. An episode that ends with Fleetwood Mac's Landslide, playing over a montage of a family falling apart, while the credits roll in silence. No jokes, no punchline, just silence. I think about something James Poniewozik of Time magazine wrote about that episode. He described the dialogue between Sharon and Randy as being remarkably authentic. He ranked it 7th on his list of the top 10 television episodes of 2011 and said the show was at once the most juvenile and most mature thing it had ever produced. And he's right, that's exactly what it is. You're Getting Old is simultaneously about farts. Literally, every piece of music in the episode sounds like flatulence, and about the crushing weight of growing older and losing the ability to find joy in things you once loved. It's juvenile and mature. It's hilarious and devastating. It's South Park. And the follow-up, Ass Burgers, Season 15, Episode 8, aired October 5th, 2011, is almost as dark in its own way, because that's the episode where they reset everything. Stan's parents get back together. His friends forgive him. The status quo is restored. But there's this detail that most people miss. In the final scene, after everything goes back to normal, Stan takes a drink. He's 10 years old, and he takes a swig of something to make the world bearable again. And the implication is clear. The cynicism didn't go away. He just learned to numb it. He learned to fake it. And that's what normal means now. Parker and Stone have talked about how they considered alternative approaches for resolving the storyline. One idea would have had Stan trying to get his parents back together across the entire second half of the season, but they kept getting stuck on the drama. They couldn't figure out how to be funny while telling that story, and ultimately, they decided to just hit the reset button, to go back to the way things were, and to make that reset itself feel like a kind of defeat. Staff writer Vernon Chapman suggested playing Landslide again as the reset happens, and that's exactly what they did. The same song, the same emotions, but this time in reverse. And this time it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels like giving up. Matt Stone later said he disliked the reset because he felt the audience had made a genuine emotional connection with You're Getting Old, and simply undoing it felt unsatisfying. But Trey Parker argued that South Park was fundamentally a cartoon comedy and needed to remain one. And I think that tension between Stone wanting to honor the darkness and Parker wanting to maintain the comedy is one of the reasons the show has stayed so compelling for so long. It's always pulling in both directions at once. Alright, let me take us somewhere different. Let me talk about one of the most disturbing choices South Park has ever made, and it has nothing to do with the content of an episode. It has to do with what happened between Season 5 and Season 6. Kenny McCormick dies in every episode. That's the gag. That's the running joke. Oh my god, they killed Kenny! You bastards! It's probably the most famous recurring bit in the show. For the first 5 seasons, Kenny died every single week. And every single week he came back with no explanation. It was a joke. It was absurd. It was part of the show's DNA. And then, on December 5th, 2001, in Kenny Dies, Season 5, Episode 13, the show did something nobody expected. They killed Kenny for real. Not as a gag, not as a setup for his inevitable return. For real. Kenny is diagnosed with a terminal muscular disease. He's hospitalized. His friends try to cope. Stan can't bring himself to visit because he can't handle seeing his friend dying. Cartman lobbies Congress to restore stem cell research, ostensibly to save Kenny, but actually because he wants to use the technology to clone a Shakey's Pizza restaurant. Chef gives Stan a speech about why God lets people die, and then Kenny dies. His hospital bed is empty when Stan finally works up the courage to visit. Kyle tells Stan that Kenny's last words were asking where Stan was, and the show played it straight. No jokes about his death. No oh my god. No you bastards. Just silence and sadness, and the weight of losing someone you love. It was, at the time, one of the most unexpected things a comedy show had ever done, taking its own running joke and making it genuinely tragic. Trey Parker and Matt Stone said on the DVD commentary that they had originally planned to kill Kyle off for a year, but decided to kill Kenny instead, because they were running out of original ways to kill him. Think about that. They chose which child character to effectively remove from the show based on creative convenience, and the one they chose was the character whose entire identity was built around dying. There's something poetically dark about that. The character who exists to die is the one who gets a real death. Kenny would remain absent for most of Season 6, which aired in 2002. His absence was filled first by Butters and then by Tweak Tweak, both of whom became more prominent characters as a result. Kenny eventually returned in the Season 6 finale, Red Sleigh Down, on December 11th, 2002. But after his return, the weekly death gag was drastically reduced. Instead of dying every episode, Kenny would die only occasionally, once or twice a season. The mechanical gag was over, and in its place was something more complicated. A character who could die, and whose death sometimes mattered, and sometimes didn't, and whose relationship with death had become genuinely existential. The show would eventually address the mechanics of Kenny's mortality in later seasons, particularly during the Mysterion storyline in Season 14's Coon trilogy. But the emotional weight of Kenny dies, the idea that this character, who we'd been laughing at dying for 5 years, could actually be someone whose death was painful and real. That's something that never fully went away. It sits underneath every subsequent Kenny death like a shadow. You laugh, and then you remember that one time it wasn't funny, and the laugh catches in your throat a little. Let me tell you about something that happened behind the scenes that most fans don't know about, and it's genuinely one of the darkest chapters in South Park's production history. Isaac Hayes, Chef, the deep-voiced, a smooth-talking cafeteria worker who was one of the show's most beloved characters. Hayes voiced Chef from the very first season in 1997, and his musical contributions, the love songs, the inappropriate advice songs, the "Hello There Children" catchphrase, were integral to the show's identity. Hayes was a legend, an Academy Award winner for the theme from Shaft, a rock and roll Hall of Famer, and for 9 seasons, he lent his talent and his voice to South Park without complaint. Then came Trapped in the Closet, Season 9, Episode 12, aired November 16, 2005. The episode that systematically dismantled Scientology, depicted Tom Cruise literally refusing to come out of a closet, and ended with a dare to the Church of Scientology to sue the show. Isaac Hayes was a Scientologist. He quit the show in March 2006 by releasing a statement saying he could no longer work on a program that showed intolerance toward religious beliefs. Parker and Stone responded by pointing out that Hayes had been perfectly comfortable with the show mocking Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, and every other religion for nearly a decade, and that his objection only arose when his own faith was the target. Matt Stone told the Associated Press at the time that the controversy showed a double standard, noting that Hayes was always fine when the show targeted other groups. And what happened next was one of the most deliberately cruel creative decisions in television history. In the Season 10 premiere, The Return of Chef, which aired on March 22nd, 2006, Parker and Stone brought Chef back using audio clips spliced together from previous episodes. And they made Chef's dialogue sound disjointed and unnatural, with the character suddenly expressing disturbing desires toward children. The plot revealed that Chef had been brainwashed by the Super Adventure Club, a transparent stand-in for Scientology, which traveled the world engaging in child molestation to harvest a substance called Marlox from children's bodies. And then they killed him in the most extreme way imaginable. Chef falls from a burning bridge, tumbles down a cliff, gets impaled on a tree branch, is struck by lightning, gets shot, and is mauled by both a mountain lion and a bear. He defecates as the final confirmation of death. It is simultaneously one of the most graphically violent scenes in South Park history, and one of its saddest. Because here's the thing, the brutality of Chef's death wasn't just shock value, it was punishment. It was Parker and Stone expressing their anger at Hayes, at Scientology, at the hypocrisy of tolerating mockery until it hits close to home, and the audience could feel both the rage and the grief simultaneously. We were watching two creators destroy a character they loved because the man who voiced him had, in their view, betrayed them. And Kyle's eulogy at the end of the episode, where he says the town shouldn't be mad at Chef, but at the fruity little club that scrambled his brains, was as close to a direct statement as Parker and Stone ever get. There's a complication to this story that makes it even darker. And some reports suggested that Hayes didn't actually quit the show voluntarily, that the statement in his name was issued by his handlers within the Church of Scientology while Hayes was recovering from a stroke. Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, said in 2016 that his father was pressured to quit by the church. If that's true, and there's no way to know for certain, then the entire saga becomes even more tragic. A man who was allegedly manipulated by a real-world organization was punished on screen for that manipulation by the creators who had been his colleagues for nearly a decade. I think about that a lot, about how the line between the show and reality blurred in that moment, about how the darkness of The Return of Chef isn't really about what happens on screen. It's about the real human relationships underneath. That two guys lost a friend and a colleague, and they process that loss through the only medium they know, a crudely animated show about construction paper people. And that's the thing about South Park's darkness that I keep coming back to. It's never just fictional. It's never just a cartoon. There's always something real underneath. Something honest and painful and complicated. And the construction paper aesthetic, the deliberately crude animation, doesn't hide that reality. It strips it bare. Let me take us to a different kind of darkness now. Not the emotional kind. The kind that makes you question what you're willing to laugh at. Woodland Critter Christmas, Season 8, Episode 14, the season finale, aired December 15th, 2004, written and directed by Trey Parker. And I think this might be the single most effective tonal bait and switch in comedy history. The episode starts with a narrator, voiced by Parker in his warmest, most bedtime story voice, telling us about a boy with a red poofball hat who finds a group of adorable talking animals in the forest. The animals are building a Christmas tree. They have names like Squirrely the squirrel and Rabbity the rabbit and Porcupiney the porcupine. They're drawn to be as cute as the South Park style allows. They speak in high cheerful voices. They're preparing for the birth of their savior. And then, about halfway through the episode, you learn that their savior is the Antichrist. The adorable woodland critters are Satanists. They sacrifice Rabbity and devour his entrails. They hold a blood orgy, and they use demonic powers to summon fire and hellhounds. They search for an unbaptized human to serve as the vessel for the Antichrist, and they find Kyle, because he's Jewish, and therefore doesn't celebrate Christmas. And then Santa Claus shows up with a shotgun and blows their heads off. And then, and this is the part that takes it from merely insane to genuinely brilliant, the entire episode is revealed to be a story that Cartman is reading to Mr. Garrison's class. It's fan fiction. Christmas fan fiction written by a 10-year-old sociopath. Kyle objects that the story is anti-Semitic. The other kids beg to hear the ending. Cartman reluctantly continues. Kyle, in the story, absorbs the Antichrist and dies of AIDS 2 weeks later. I've thought a lot about what makes Woodland Critter Christmas so effective, and I think it comes down to the sincerity of the setup. The first third of the episode is genuinely charming. The narrator's voice is warm. The music is pleasant. The forest setting is cozy. You actually believe, for a few minutes, that South Park is doing a straight Christmas special. And then the rug is pulled, and the adorable animals start performing satanic rituals, and the sweetness curdles into horror, and you realize you've been played. That's Trey Parker's genius as a storyteller. He understands that darkness is most effective when it follows light. That horror is most potent when it arrives uninvited into a space that felt safe. Woodland Critter Christmas works because you let your guard down. You relaxed. You trusted the narrator. And then the narrator, who turns out to be Cartman, used that trust to drag you somewhere you never would have gone willingly. And here's a dark production detail. Trey Parker has said that the Woodland Critters are among his favorite creations. He loves them. He thinks the blood orgy is hilarious. And he brought them back in subsequent episodes and in the video game, South Park: The Stick of Truth. They've become fan favorites. Adorable satanic animals that sacrifice each other and hold blood orgies are fan favorites. Think about that. Think about what that says about the audience South Park has cultivated over 30 years. You know what? Let me stay with this episode for another minute, because there's a structural element to Woodland Critter Christmas that I think is genuinely masterful and deeply dark. The entire episode is a story within a story. It's Cartman's Christmas narrative for Mr. Garrison's class, and the reveal that everything we've been watching is a product of Cartman's imagination changes what the darkness means. It's not the show that created the blood orgies and the satanic rituals. It's Cartman. A 10-year-old boy wrote a Christmas story about devil-worshipping animals performing blood orgies and an abortion clinic teaching mountain lion cubs how to terminate pregnancies, and Santa Claus executing small animals with a shotgun. And nobody in the classroom seems particularly alarmed by this. Mr. Garrison asks Cartman to stop because Kyle objects, not because the content is disturbing. The other kids want to hear the ending. The adults treat this as a normal creative writing exercise that went a little off track, rather than what it actually is, a window into the mind of a deeply disturbed child. That framing device makes the episode exponentially darker, because the question shifts from how dark can South Park go to what kind of child would create this? And the answer is the kind of child that South Park has been building for 8 seasons. The kind of child who would later feed a boy his own parents. The kind of child who would deliberately infect his classmate with AIDS. The kind of child whose imagination is a factory of cruelty and whose environment has never provided any check on that cruelty. Woodland Critter Christmas isn't just a dark episode, it's evidence. It's a prosecution exhibit in the case of Eric Cartman, and the fact that nobody in the episode recognizes it as evidence is the darkest thing about it. Let me talk about another episode that uses darkness in a way that I think deserves more attention. The China Program, Season 12, Episode 8, aired October 8, 2008. This is the one that most people remember for the Indiana Jones scenes, and with good reason, because those scenes are among the most disturbing things South Park has ever produced. The B-plot of the episode involves Stan and Kyle processing their feelings about Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. They believe that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas have assaulted Indiana Jones with their terrible film, and the show depicts this belief literally. It recreates actual assault scenes from films like Deliverance, The Accused, and Boys Don't Cry, with Indiana Jones as the victim, and Spielberg and Lucas as the perpetrators. I remember watching this episode when it aired and genuinely not knowing what to do with it. The scenes are graphic, they're disturbing, they go on too long, and the joke that a bad sequel is equivalent to a violent crime is, on one level, obviously ridiculous. Nobody actually believes that making a bad movie is the same as assault. The hyperbole is the joke. But here's what makes it dark rather than just provocative. The show commits to the metaphor. It doesn't wink. It doesn't break character. It plays the assault scenes with the same gravity and horror that they carry in the original films. And the result is that you're watching something genuinely distressing. Graphic depictions of violence that mirror real crimes. And you can't quite settle on whether you're supposed to be laughing or not. The show has removed the safety net of ironic distance. It's forcing you to sit with imagery that's genuinely traumatic and decide for yourself what it means. Some critics thought the episode went too far. Some thought it was brilliant. Most thought it was both. And that ambiguity, the inability to settle on a single response, is the point. South Park doesn't want you to know how to feel. It wants you to feel everything at once, and then figure out what that experience tells you about yourself. While I'm on the subject of episodes that push boundaries in uncomfortable ways, let me talk briefly about Human Centipede. Season 15, Episode 1, aired April 27th, 2011. This was the first episode produced after Parker and Stone returned from the opening of The Book of Mormon on Broadway. It was the episode documented in the 6 Days to Air special, and it's a lot. The episode is a parody of The Human Centipede, the notorious 2009 Dutch horror film. Kyle, who didn't read Apple's terms and conditions before agreeing to them, is subjected to a procedure in which he's surgically connected to an iPad and a second person. The imagery is exactly what you're imagining. It's grotesque. It's visceral. It's designed to make you deeply uncomfortable. And the B-plot involves Cartman throwing a tantrum because his mother won't buy him an iPad. He escalates from tantrums to emotional manipulation to genuinely cruel behavior, culminating in a scene that I'm not going to describe in detail because it's one of the most transgressive things the show has ever aired. What I find interesting about Human Centipede is that it was the episode Parker and Stone chose to make when they came back from their Broadway triumph. They'd just created one of the most acclaimed musicals of the century. They'd won Tony Awards. They'd been celebrated by the cultural establishment. And their first creative act upon returning to South Park was to make an episode about a child being surgically attached to an iPad in a parody of a body horror film. That tells you something about Parker and Stone's relationship with respectability. They don't want it. They actively flee from it. Every time the mainstream culture tries to embrace them, every time they win an award, or sign a billion-dollar deal, or get profiled in a respectable publication, they respond by making something so crude and offensive that the embrace has to loosen. It's a form of self-sabotage, or maybe it's a form of integrity. The line between the two isn't always clear. Let me also spend a moment on the Imagination Land trilogy. Season 11, episodes 10 through 12, aired October 17th through November 14th, 2007, because it contains one of the show's most underappreciated dark moments. The three-parter is, on the surface, a fantastical adventure in which the boys enter a realm where every fictional character ever imagined coexists. It's fun, it's creative, it's visually ambitious by South Park standards. But the through line of the story is a bet between Cartman and Kyle about whether leprechauns are real. Cartman bets Kyle that if leprechauns are proven to exist, Kyle has to suck Cartman's genitals. And Cartman spends the entire trilogy pursuing this bet with the single-minded determination of a serial predator, while the world is literally being destroyed by evil imaginary characters, while Butters is performing acts of heroism in Imagination Land, while the government is debating whether to nuke the realm of imagination, Cartman is focused exclusively on forcing Kyle to perform a sexual act. The contrast between the epic stakes of the A-plot and the petty, disturbing obsessiveness of Cartman's subplot creates a tonal dissonance that's genuinely unsettling. It's funny, it's D, but it's also a portrait of a mind that cannot be moved by anything larger than its own desires. The world can burn. Cartman doesn't care. He wants what he wants. And in the end, a court rules in Cartman's favor. Kyle is legally obligated to honor the bet. The episode ends with Cartman, triumphant, standing over Kyle with his pants around his ankles, as Kyle kneels before him. We don't see what happens next, but the implication is clear. I've seen people debate whether this scene is funny or horrifying, and I think the answer is yes, both at the same time. It's a scene that makes you laugh, and then, moments later, makes you feel dirty for laughing. And that duality, that uncomfortable coexistence of comedy and violation, is the engine that drives South Park's entire approach to darkness. The show doesn't want you to have a clean reaction. It wants you to have a messy one. A reaction that implicates you. A reaction that forces you to ask, why did I laugh at that? What does it say about me that I found that funny? And what does it say about the world that created a show where that's considered entertainment? Those questions don't have easy answers. They shouldn't. If the answers were easy, the show wouldn't need to exist. Let me talk about one more dark pattern before I move on to the broader themes. The show's treatment of disability and neurodivergence. Because this is another area where South Park's history is complex and sometimes genuinely troubling. Timmy and Jimmy, both disabled characters, were introduced in the early 2000s. Timmy, who has a developmental disability and can only say his own name and a few other words, was introduced in Season 4. Jimmy, who has a physical disability and uses crutches, was introduced in Season 5. Both characters were controversial from the beginning. Were they mocking disabled people? Were they normalizing disability by treating disabled characters with the same irreverence as everyone else? Were they doing both at once? And the answer, as with most things in South Park, is complicated. Episodes like Cripple Fight, Season 5, Episode 2, June 27, 2001, use disability as the premise for shock comedy. The episode features an extended fight sequence between Timmy and Jimmy that mirrors the bar fight in They Live. But episodes like Up the Down Steroid, Season 8, Episode 2, March 24th, and 2004, showed Jimmy as a fully realized character with his own moral struggles as he deals with the temptation of using steroids to win at the Special Olympics. And Crazy Cripples, Season 7, Episode 2, March 26, 2003, did something remarkably subversive by having Timmy and Jimmy form their own group for people who were born crippled, excluding Christopher Reeve because his disability was acquired. The episode satirized the idea that disability is a monolithic experience, that all disabled people share the same identity, and suggested that the politics of disability are as fraught and complicated as any other form of identity politics. That's genuinely insightful social commentary, but it exists alongside episodes that use the word cripple as a punchline, that derive comedy from the shock of seeing disabled characters in violent situations, and that sometimes reduce complex human experiences to one-dimensional jokes. The show's treatment of disability is a microcosm of its treatment of everything else. Sometimes brilliant, sometimes careless, always provocative, never simple. And the darkest aspect of it isn't any specific episode. It's the fact that for many viewers, South Park's portrayal of Timmy and Jimmy is their primary exposure to disabled characters in media. And if that portrayal is inconsistent, sometimes respectful, sometimes reductive, then the lessons viewers absorb will be equally inconsistent. The show can't control how its audience interprets its content, but it bears some responsibility for the interpretive framework it creates. And in the case of disability, that framework is uneven at best. Okay, let me talk about Brittany's new look, because this is an episode that I think about differently now than I did when it first aired. And the gap between those two reactions is, itself, a dark story. Season 12, Episode 2, aired March 19th, 2008. Written and directed by Trey Parker. The episode was produced in the immediate aftermath of Britney Spears' very public mental health crisis. The head shaving, the erratic behavior, the paparazzi obsession, the loss of custody of her children. All of it. And South Park's response was to make an episode in which Britney Spears attempts suicide by shooting herself in the head, survives with most of her head missing, and is then systematically destroyed by a society that literally feeds on her suffering. But the plot is a direct adaptation of Shirley Jackson's 1948 short story, The Lottery. In that story, a small town holds an annual lottery to select a person to be stoned to death as a sacrifice for a good harvest. In South Park's version, the sacrifice is celebrity destruction. Society picks a young woman, Britney in this case, and hounds her until she breaks. When she's sufficiently broken, when she's been photographed and mocked and dehumanized to the point of death, the corn harvest comes in strong. And here's the part that hits different now. In the final scene, after Britney has been photographed to death, literally killed by the collective act of documenting her destruction, the townspeople go to the supermarket and admire the good harvest. A news broadcast announces that Miley Cyrus is becoming a rising star. The Randy Marsh looks at the screen and says something that makes you realize the cycle is about to start again. Kyle and Stan, who have spent the entire episode trying to save Britney, look at each other, and then they join in the chanting. They give up. They join the mob. Because you can't fight it. You can't stop it. The machine that destroys young women for public entertainment is bigger than any individual act of compassion. And the thing that makes this episode so prescient, so dark in retrospect, is that it came out years before the hashtag Free Britney movement revealed the actual, real-world mechanisms of control that had been exercised over Britney Spears. The conservatorship, the medications, the loss of autonomy. South Park saw it in 2008. And they saw that what was happening to Britney Spears wasn't gossip or entertainment. It was ritual sacrifice. And they said so, bluntly, in the way only South Park can. And most people, at the time, laughed it off. I didn't take this episode seriously when it first aired. I thought it was clever, but excessive. A bit too on the nose. A bit too dark for its own good. And then, 13 years later, when the details of the conservatorship became public, I went back and rewatched it, and I sat there for a long time afterward, just thinking. Because South Park had told us the truth in 2008. They had shown us what we were doing, and we hadn't listened. We'd laughed, and we'd changed the channel, and we'd gone right back to consuming the spectacle. That's maybe the darkest fact about South Park that I know, not what happens in the show. What the show says about us, about what we're willing to ignore, about what we're willing to laugh at, about the gap between knowing something is wrong and actually doing anything about it. Let me tell you about the episodes you can't watch. There are 5 South Park episodes that have been removed from every streaming platform, every rerun schedule, every official source of the show. They are effectively banned. You cannot watch them legally unless you own the DVD box sets. And even then, some of them are censored on the DVDs. These 5 episodes are Super Best Friends, Season 5, Episode 3, originally aired July 4th, 2001. Cartoon Wars Part 1, Season 10, Episode 3. Cartoon Wars Part 2, Season 10, Episode 4. 200, Season 14, Episode 5. Aired April 14th, 2010. And 201, Season 14, Episode 6. Aired April 21st, 2010. All 5 episodes involve depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, and the story of how they came to be banned is one of the darkest chapters in the history of American television. Not because of what happens in the episodes themselves, but because of what happened in the real world as a consequence of their existence. Let me walk you through it. In 2001, Super Best Friends featured Muhammad as a member of a Justice League-style team of religious figures. He appeared on screen, uncensored, with fire powers. Nobody cared. The episode aired without incident. Muhammad was just another character, drawn in the same crude style as everyone else, doing superhero stuff alongside Jesus and Buddha and Moses. Then, in 2005, the Jyllands-Posten controversy erupted in Denmark. A newspaper published cartoon depictions of Muhammad. Protests spread worldwide. Violence followed. The question of whether it was acceptable to depict Muhammad in visual media became one of the most heated debates in global politics. When South Park returned to the topic in 2006's Cartoon Wars 2-parter, Comedy Central got nervous. The network refused to allow Muhammad to be shown on screen. Parker and Stone were furious. They believed they had the right to depict any religious figure in the same way they depicted every other religious figure. Comedy Central disagreed. Muhammad was hidden behind a black, censored bar, and on-screen text acknowledged that the network had overruled the creators. Then came 2010, episodes 200 and 201. For the show's landmark 200th episode, Parker and Stone brought back virtually every celebrity and organization the show had ever mocked. Tom Cruise, Kanye West, Mel Gibson, Rob Reiner, Barbra Streisand, dozens more, in a massive class action lawsuit against the town of South Park. The plot involved the celebrities demanding to meet Muhammad, believing his power to not be mocked could be transferred to them. It was a meta-commentary on censorship itself, a show about the fact that this show wasn't allowed to show certain things. After 200 aired, a group called Revolution Muslim posted a warning on their website. They referenced the murder of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, who had been killed after making a film critical of Islamic treatment of women. They posted the addresses of South Park Studios. The implication was clear. 201 aired a week later, but not as Parker and Stone intended. Comedy Central censored the episode extensively, not just Muhammad's image. His name was bleeped every time it was spoken. And the final speech of the episode, in which Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus deliver a message about standing up to intimidation and refusing to let threats dictate what you can and can't say, the thematic culmination of the entire two-parter, was completely bleeped out. The audience heard nothing. The message was silenced. And then all 5 Muhammad episodes were pulled, removed from the website, removed from streaming, removed from reruns. To this day, they remain unavailable on Paramount Plus, on Max, on any legitimate platform. The only way to watch them is on physical media, and even the DVD versions of 200 and 201 are censored. The New York State Police increased security around South Park Studios after 201 aired. Parker and Stone continued to work. They didn't make public statements about being afraid, but they also never made another episode about Muhammad. And the 5 banned episodes became a kind of ghost in the show's catalog, present in the numbering, absent from the content. Silent spaces where stories used to be. I think that's genuinely one of the darkest things that's ever happened in American comedy. Not because of what was depicted. South Park has shown far worse things than a cartoon character in a bear suit, but because of what it revealed about the limits of free expression in a supposedly free society. Trey Parker and Matt Stone built a show whose entire philosophy is that nothing should be off limits, and that comedy should be an equal opportunity offender, that the cure for bad speech is more speech, not censorship. And then reality showed up and drew a line that even they couldn't cross. And the silence where those episodes used to be is itself a kind of darkness. Okay, I want to shift to something else now, because we've been talking a lot about specific episodes, and I think it's important to zoom out and look at some of the darker patterns that run through the show as a whole. Patterns that only become visible when you watch hundreds of episodes over decades. Let me talk about Kenny McCormick and poverty. Kenny is the poor kid. That's his thing. He lives on the wrong side of the tracks. His house is a shambles. His parents are alcoholics. His family survives on whatever scraps they can find. And the show treats this as a running joke. The other boys occasionally comment on Kenny's poverty, usually in passing, usually as the setup for some other gag. It's normalized. It's background information. Kenny is poor the way Cartman is fat, and Kyle is Jewish, and Stan is Stan. But if you actually track what Kenny's poverty means across the show's run, the picture that emerges is genuinely disturbing. Kenny can't afford lunch at school. He can't participate in activities that cost money. His parents' alcoholism creates an unstable, sometimes dangerous home environment. His older brother Kevin and younger sister Karen are similarly neglected. In The Poor Kid, Season 15, Episode 14, November 16, 2011, Kenny's parents are arrested for operating a meth lab, and the McCormick children are sent to a foster home. Then the foster home is run by aggressive, emotionally abusive adults, and the entire ordeal is filmed for a reality TV show called White Trash and Trouble. Think about what that episode is saying. Not just that Kenny's life is hard, but that his hardship is entertainment, that his family's dysfunction is content, that the system that's supposed to protect children in his situation is itself exploitative and abusive. And the episode plays all of this for comedy, of course, because it's South Park. But underneath the comedy, there's a portrait of institutional failure that's as damning as anything in a prestige drama. Kenny's deaths take on a different weight when you think about them through the lens of poverty. In the early seasons, the running gag was that Kenny died because the universe was randomly cruel. But as the show evolved and Kenny's home life became more developed, the deaths started to feel less random and more systemic. Kenny dies because nobody is watching out for him. Nobody is keeping him safe. His parents are too drunk or too poor or too overwhelmed to protect their child. And when he dies, the world moves on without pausing, because the death of a poor kid in a small town is, in the calculus of society, not particularly important. A professor at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point named Karen Fry actually wrote an essay about Kenny's deaths in the book, South Park and Philosophy. You know, I learned something today. Exploring the parallels between Kenny's role in the show and existentialist philosophy. And a researcher at the University of Strasbourg named Sophie Rutschman discovered a mutated gene that causes fruit flies to die within 2 days of infection with certain bacteria. And she named the gene Kenny in honor of the character. A real scientist named a real gene after a cartoon character who dies every week. If that's not a strange form of cultural immortality for a meditation on the disposability of poor people, I don't know what is. Let me talk about another dark pattern, the evolution of Randy Marsh. In the early seasons, Randy was a background character, Stan's dad, a geologist. He showed up occasionally, said something awkward, and faded back into the scenery. But starting around season 8, and accelerating dramatically from season 12 onward, Randy became arguably the show's lead character. And his evolution tracks a very specific arc, from reasonable adult to narcissistic man-child to full-blown grotesque. And here's what I find dark about it. Randy's evolution mirrors a cultural shift. As the show progressed through the 2000s and into the 2010s, Randy became more selfish, more performative, more desperate for attention and validation. He started chasing trends. He started treating his family as props in his own narrative. He became the person who thinks they're the protagonist of every situation when they're actually the problem. In You're Getting Old, Sharon confronts Randy directly. She tells him she's been unhappy for a long time. And the scene plays with an emotional authenticity that's shocking for a show that had spent 20 minutes making literal crap jokes. It feels real. And it feels like a conversation between a woman who has watched her husband become someone she doesn't recognize, and a man who is only now, in this moment, forced to confront that truth. And here's the dark meta layer. Parker has acknowledged that Randy is, in many ways, a version of himself. Not literally. Parker isn't a narcissist or a man-child, but Randy's restlessness, his inability to be satisfied, his compulsion to constantly reinvent himself. Parker sees those tendencies in his own creative process. When Randy can't stop chasing the next obsession, that's Parker unable to stop chasing the next episode, the next idea, the next season of a show that he's been making since he was 27 years old and will still be making when he's 60, probably. And that's dark. That's not because Parker is a bad person, he's clearly not, but because the show he's made has become a mirror that he can't look away from. He's trapped in a creative relationship with his own reflection, and every season, the reflection gets a little more unflattering, a little more honest, a little more exhausting to confront. Let me take us somewhere really specific now. I want to talk about an episode that I think is the most quietly devastating thing South Park has ever done, and it's one that most people overlook when they talk about the show's darkest moments. Stanley's Cup, Season 10, Episode 14, aired November 15th, 2006, the season finale. The episode is a parody of The Mighty Ducks and every other underdog sports movie you've ever seen. Stan's bicycle gets impounded, and to get it back, he has to coach a pee-wee hockey team. The kids are terrible. They can't skate. They can't hold their sticks. They're 5 years old. And one of them, a boy named Nelson Brown, has cancer. Nelson is bald and dying, and he just wants to see his team win one game before he goes. The episode sets up every single beat of the sports movie formula. The montage, the rival team, the big game, the kid in the hospital watching on TV, the crowd chanting. You know exactly where this is going. You've seen this movie 100 times. The kids are going to win. Nelson is going to smile. Stan is going to learn something about himself. The music is going to swell. Credits. That's not what happens. What happens is that the Pee-wee hockey team doesn't play another Pee-wee team in the championship. They play the Detroit Red Wings, an actual NHL team, with adult players, full-sized adults, professional hockey players, against 5-year-olds. And the Red Wings destroy them, not in a funny cartoon way, in a genuinely brutal way. The children are knocked around the ice. They're battered. They're crying. The crowd chants, "Let them play! Let them play!" as tiny children are beaten by professional athletes. And then, in the final shot, Nelson dies. That's the ending. The kid with cancer dies. The team loses. There is no redemption. There is no silver lining. There is no lesson learned. The sports movie formula that we've been conditioned to expect, that we've been trained by decades of Hollywood to rely on, simply doesn't deliver. The narrative machinery that's supposed to produce catharsis instead produces nothing. Just a dead kid and a lost game, and the terrible recognition that the universe does not, in fact, arrange itself into satisfying stories. Parker and Stone defended the ending in their DVD commentary. They said they thought it was sweet and weird, that a lot of people didn't get it. And Matt Stone said the episode was like 3/4 of a show, but the ending was fantastic. And I think they're right, but I also think sweet is an interesting word to use for an episode that ends with a child dying of cancer while watching his team get annihilated. I think what they meant was that there's something honest about it, something that refuses to lie to the audience. Because in real life, the kid with cancer doesn't always get better. In real life, the underdog team doesn't always win. In real life, the universe isn't a story, and it doesn't owe you a happy ending. That's one of the darkest ideas South Park has ever expressed, and they expressed it through a Pee Wee hockey episode, through the most innocuous possible vehicle. And that's the trick again. That's always the trick. The darkness works because of where it arrives. Not in a dark episode about a dark subject, in a sports parody, in a Christmas special, in a birthday party, in the spaces where you're supposed to feel safe. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a video about a cartoon show. This is a video about what it means to look at something familiar, something you've grown up with, something you've laughed at thousands of times, and see the shadows inside it. See the parts that aren't funny. See the questions it's asking underneath the jokes. Let me talk about the animation, because the animation itself is a kind of darkness, and I don't think people think about it that way. South Park started as literal paper cutouts. The original Spirit of Christmas shorts in the mid-1990s were made with actual construction paper, cut and moved by hand, frame by frame. When the show was picked up by Comedy Central, the first season used a combination of paper cutouts and early computer animation. By season 5, the show had transitioned entirely to digital production using Autodesk Maya, but the visual style deliberately mimicked the limitations of the original paper cutout technique. The characters still look like they're made of paper. The movements are still jerky and limited. The backgrounds are still flat and simple. This is a choice. This is not a limitation. South Park could look like anything. The technology exists to make it look as smooth and polished as any other animated show. But Parker and Stone chose to maintain the crude aesthetic, and that choice has profound implications for how the darkness lands. Think about it this way. When something horrible happens on The Simpsons or Family Guy, the high-quality animation creates a kind of safety net. The characters look good. The backgrounds are detailed. The visual richness reassures you that you're watching a professional product, a crafted, controlled fiction. The darkness is contained within the frame. South Park doesn't have that safety net. The crude animation feels unfinished. It feels raw. It feels like something that was made in a hurry by people who didn't have time to make it look nice, which, given the 6-day production cycle, is literally true. And that rawness makes the dark content feel closer, more real, less mediated. When Cartman feeds Scott Tenorman his parents in a show that looks like a professional production, it's shocking. When Cartman feeds Scott Tenorman his parents in a show that looks like it was made with scissors and tape, it's uncanny. It activates a different part of your brain. The part that processes things that feel wrong on a fundamental level. The part that recognizes that the crude simplicity of the image is, itself, a form of violence. A refusal to dress up horror in attractive packaging. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think the animation style is the single most underappreciated aspect of South Park's darkness. It's not just what the show depicts, it's how it depicts it. The deliberate ugliness, the intentional limitations, the refusal to make horror beautiful. There's something deeply honest about that, and something deeply unsettling. Let me talk about music for a while, because Trey Parker is, in addition to everything else, a genuinely talented musician and composer, and his musical contributions to South Park contain some of the show's darkest moments. The most obvious example is Kyle's Mom's a Bitch, the gleefully offensive song from the 1999 film South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, where Cartman leads the entire world in a musical number about how much he hates Sheila Broflovsky. It's funny, it's catchy, it's also deeply cruel. But what makes it dark isn't the cruelty itself, it's the craft. Parker wrote a song that's so musically appealing, so expertly composed, so fun to sing along with, that you find yourself enjoying it before you register what you're actually singing. He weaponized musicality. He made you complicit in the mockery by making it impossible not to tap your foot. He does this throughout the show. Blame Canada, nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song, is a satirical anthem about scapegoating, wrapped in a melody so catchy that it was performed at the Oscar ceremony itself. La Resistance is a Les Miserables parody that's simultaneously a joke about pompous musical theater and a genuinely stirring call to arms. The songs work on multiple levels simultaneously, and the musical quality, the fact that Parker can actually write really good songs, is what makes the darkness underneath so effective. And you know what? Let me spend more time on the film. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. Because it's arguably the darkest single piece of South Park media ever produced, and it doesn't get treated that way in most discussions. The film came out on June 30th, 1999. It was rated R. It was a musical. And its plot: four boys sneak into an R-rated movie, start swearing, get their favorite show blamed for corrupting America's youth, trigger a war between the United States and Canada, and eventually witness the coming of Satan and Saddam Hussein, is one of the most ambitious and savage pieces of social satire ever committed to film. But here's what I think makes it genuinely dark, and it's not the profanity or the violence or the depiction of hell, it's the Mole. Then the Mole is a minor character, a French-Canadian resistance fighter, who helps the boys break into the USO show to save Terrence and Philip from execution, and the Mole dies. He's killed by guard dogs, and his death is played relatively straight. He lies on the ground, bleeding, and curses God for abandoning him. He's a child, roughly the same age as the boys, and he dies in a war that was started because adults couldn't handle their children watching a movie. The Mole's death is buried inside a comedy musical. It happens fast. It's surrounded by jokes and songs and the usual South Park chaos. But if you stop and think about it, if you strip away the context and just look at what happened, a child died in a pointless war caused by moral panic over media content. And the film barely pauses to acknowledge it before moving on to the next set piece. That's the darkest possible commentary on how society treats children, not just in South Park, in the real world. Children die in wars that adults started. Children die because of policies that adults enacted. Children die because adults were too busy fighting about movies and video games and song lyrics to address the actual threats. And the Mole's death, quick, ignored, forgotten, is the film's most honest statement about how those deaths are treated, as collateral damage, as background noise, as the cost of doing business in a culture that cares more about what children see than what children experience. And Parker's musical score for the film is, honestly, brilliant. It was nominated for an Academy Award. Then the songs range from crude comedy to genuine theatrical ambition. And the juxtaposition between the sophistication of the music and the darkness of the content is one of the things that makes the film work. You're watching a cartoon about children dying in a war, set to Broadway quality musical numbers, and the cognitive dissonance between form and content is doing something to your brain that you can't quite articulate. It's making you process horror through beauty. It's making you dance to despair. Parker has said that writing the film was one of the most exhausting creative experiences of his life. He and Stone worked on it for over a year, far longer than any episode of the show. And the result is a piece of work that's both more polished and more raw than anything they've done for television. The darkness in the film isn't the 6-day cycle darkness of the show. Compressed, urgent, sometimes unfinished. It's a considered darkness, a deliberate darkness. A darkness that's been thought through and refined and crafted with the same care as one of Parker's melodies. And the fact that it was released just 2 months after Columbine, as I mentioned earlier, gives the film an additional layer of weight that it carries, whether Parker and Stone intended it or not. A film about children dying because adults couldn't handle controversial media, released into a culture that was actively trying to blame controversial media for children dying. The timing was either cosmically cruel or cosmically perfect, depending on how you look at it. The film made approximately $83 million worldwide against a production budget of $21 million. It was a commercial and critical success, and the Academy Award nomination for Blame Canada led to one of the most talked about moments in Oscar history. Parker and Stone showed up to the ceremony wearing dresses, having taken acid before arriving. They've talked about this in interviews. They took psychedelics and went to the Academy Awards in drag for a song about blaming Canada for corrupting American children. The whole thing is so layered with irony and absurdity that it loops back around to being oddly sincere. Two guys from Colorado, tripping on acid in ball gowns, waiting to find out if their song about moral panic won an Oscar. South Park, in a nutshell. Let me also mention something about how the show handles its own history, because this is something that adds a layer of darkness that only becomes visible when you've been watching for a very long time. South Park has a complicated relationship with continuity. In the early seasons, there was almost none. Everything reset at the end of every episode. Kenny died and came back. Lessons were forgotten. Character development was minimal. The show existed in a perpetual present tense, and that was part of its charm. But as the series progressed, especially from season 18 onward, the show began experimenting with serialization and continuity. Characters remembered things, events had consequences, storylines carried over, and this shift from episodic to serialized created a strange tension with the show's history. Because if events have consequences now, what about all the events that had no consequences before? What about the hundreds of traumas and disasters and violations that the characters experienced and then forgot? The answer is, they didn't forget. Not really. The show's turn toward continuity didn't erase the episodic past. It reframed it. All those standalone episodes, all those reset button endings, all those lessons learned and immediately discarded, they're still there. They're still part of the character's experience. And the fact that the characters behaved as if those experiences didn't matter is, itself, a portrait of how trauma works. You don't always process it in real time. You bury it. You move on. You pretend it didn't happen. And then, years later, it surfaces, and you realize that all those things you thought you'd forgotten have been shaping you all along. And Stan's depression in You're Getting Old can be read this way, as the cumulative weight of 15 seasons of unprocessed trauma finally breaking through the surface. Kyle's moral exhaustion in later seasons can be read as the natural result of spending decades fighting battles that never stayed won. Even Cartman's escalating sociopathy can be read as the logical endpoint of a character who was never given boundaries, never faced consequences, never had an adult look at him and say, stop. The show's turn towards serialization didn't just change its structure, it changed its meaning. It turned 300 standalone episodes into a single, sprawling story about what happens when a society fails its children and then expects those children to be fine. And the fact that the children aren't fine, that Stan is depressed, and Kyle is exhausted, and Cartman is a monster, and Kenny keeps dying, is the show's final, devastating argument. The reset button was always a lie. The damage was always accumulating, and the darkness was always there, waiting to be acknowledged. But the darkest use of music in South Park isn't one of Parker's original compositions. It's the use of Fleetwood Mac's Landslide in You're Getting Old. I've already talked about that episode, but I want to focus specifically on that musical choice for a moment, because the decision to use Landslide, a song about time passing and change, and the fear of growing older, is one of the most emotionally sophisticated things the show has ever done. Throughout the episode, every piece of music is contaminated by the fart sound motif. Tween wave sounds like defecation. Classic rock sounds like defecation. Everything is literally crap. And then Landslide plays, and it's clean. No fart sounds, no crap overlay, just Stevie Nicks' voice and the guitar, clear and unaltered, over a montage of a family falling apart. The implication is devastating. In a world where everything sounds like crap, Landslide is the one thing that isn't corrupted. And the reason it isn't corrupted is because it's not trying to entertain. It's not trying to be cool or edgy or current. It's just sad. It's just honest. It's just a woman singing about getting older and wondering if she can make it through the changes. And in the context of an episode about a boy who can no longer find joy in anything, then the purity of that sadness is the only thing that feels real. Parker has said in commentaries that the dialogue between Sharon and Randy in that episode, the conversation where Sharon says she's been unhappy for a long time, was one of the last things written. He described it almost as an afterthought, and yet it became the most talked about moment in the episode's broadcast. Critics and fans alike fixated on it. They read it as Parker and Stone talking about their own relationship with the show. Were they unhappy? Were they done? Was South Park over? The episode aired as the mid-season finale, and the second half of season 15 didn't premiere for 4 months, until October 5th, 2011. 4 months of silence. 4 months where fans genuinely didn't know if the show would come back. 4 months where Landslide and an empty bedroom were the last images South Park had left them with. That gap, that 4-month silence, is itself a form of darkness. Parker and Stone left their audience sitting with despair. They didn't rush to reassure anyone. They didn't tweet about it. They didn't release a statement saying everything was fine. They just left. and the silence said more than any episode could. Let me talk about the Muhammad controversy one more time, because there's an aspect of it that I glossed over earlier, and it deserves more attention. When 201 aired on April 21st, 2010, Comedy Central censored it so heavily that the episode was, in many respects, unwatchable. The bleeping wasn't just applied to Muhammad's name, it was applied to the entire closing speech. Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus each deliver a portion of the speech, which is supposed to be the thematic climax of the entire two-parter. The show's definitive statement on the relationship between free expression and intimidation. And nobody heard it. The network bleeped the whole thing. Parker and Stone issued a statement saying that they had delivered the speech uncensored and that the bleeping was Comedy Central's decision, not theirs. They also noted the irony that an episode about the dangers of censoring comedy in response to threats had itself been censored in response to threats. The meta-darkness of that situation is almost too perfect. The episode was proving its own thesis in real time, and nobody could hear the thesis because it had been silenced. To this day, the uncensored version of 201 has never been officially released, and the speech remains unheard. And the question at its center, what happens to a society that allows threats to determine what can and cannot be said, remains unanswered. Or rather, it was answered, just not in the way Parker and Stone intended. The answer, demonstrated by the very fact of the censorship, is the threats work, the threats silence, the threats win. And South Park, a show built on the principle that nothing should be off limits, had to accept that some things are, in fact, off limits. That there are powers in the world more powerful than satire. That a cartoon can change minds and shape culture and influence millions of people, but it cannot protect itself from people willing to kill over a drawing. That's dark. That's really, genuinely dark. And it's not a cartoon dark. It's a real world dark. And it casts a shadow over every subsequent episode of the show. Because every time Parker and Stone sit down to write, they're writing in the knowledge that there are things they've been prevented from saying. And that silence, that invisible fence around certain topics, is a wound in the show's identity that has never fully healed. Alright, let me take us somewhere different. Let me talk about some of the smaller dark facts. The details that don't get their own Wikipedia articles, but that, when you collect them together, paint a picture of a show that's far more unsettling than most people realize. Did you know that the original pilot of South Park, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, the very first episode, was almost rejected by Comedy Central? Not because it was too offensive, because the network thought it wasn't offensive enough, and they sent notes asking Parker and Stone to push the content further, to be cruder, more shocking, more extreme. The network that would later censor Muhammad was, at the beginning, actively encouraging the show to be worse. Think about what that says about the relationship between commerce and transgression. Comedy Central didn't want art. They wanted outrage. They wanted the shock value that would generate press coverage and water cooler conversation. And Parker and Stone gave it to them, but they also slipped something genuine underneath it. They used the cover of gross out comedy to build a show that actually had something to say. Did you know that Trey Parker has spoken about his struggles with creative depression? In interviews around the Book of Mormon period, and during the production of season 15, and he's discussed the feeling of creative exhaustion, the sense that everything has already been done, that there's nothing new to say, that the well is dry. And every time he talks about it, you can hear the echo of Stan Marsh in You're Getting Old, the character who sees everything as crap, the kid who can't find joy anymore. Parker created that character as a mirror, and the reflections stared back. Did you know that there's a specific technique the show uses to make its darkest moments land? It's something I've noticed over years of watching, and I've never seen anyone else talk about it. In the moments right before something truly awful happens, before Cartman reveals the chili, before Brittany shoots herself, before Chef falls from the bridge, there's usually a beat of silence. A fraction of a second where the music drops out and the dialogue stops, and the crude little faces just sit there. It's a pause, a held breath, and it's incredibly effective. Because in a show that moves at breakneck speed, that moves from joke to joke without stopping, that silence is loud. It's the show telling you, pay attention, this next thing matters. Did you know that the show's creators almost burned out completely during the production of The Book of Mormon? The 2011 Broadway musical, which won 9 Tony Awards, was developed simultaneously with South Park's ongoing production. Parker and Stone were writing and producing the musical, while also maintaining the 6-day production cycle for the show. In 6 days to air, You can see the toll this dual workload takes. Parker looks haunted. Stone looks resigned. And the other members of the production team look like they're holding together through sheer institutional memory. And somehow, despite all of it, they produced You're Getting Old during this period, one of the show's finest and most emotionally complex episodes. That's a dark irony. The episode about creative exhaustion was itself a product of creative exhaustion. The episode about the world turning to crap was made by people who felt like their world was turning to crap. And it's brilliant. But it's also a document of real suffering, dressed up as entertainment, served to millions of people who consumed it without knowing what it cost. Let me talk about the show's relationship with death more broadly, because death in South Park is not what it is in other shows. In most television, death is an event. It happens, and it matters. Characters mourn, plot lines shift. The world of the show changes permanently. Even in comedies, death is treated with at least a token amount of gravity. South Park treats death like weather. It happens constantly, casually, to characters major and minor, and the world resets afterward as though nothing occurred. People die in South Park all the time. Not just Kenny, but bystanders, celebrities, animals, aliens, everybody. Death is background noise. It's ambient, and the show's refusal to treat death as meaningful is paradoxically one of the most meaningful things about it. Because what South Park is doing with its casual approach to death is exactly what it accuses society of doing with real tragedy, normalizing it, making it invisible, turning horror into wallpaper. When a character dies in South Park and nobody reacts, well, we laugh at the absurdity. But when children die in school shootings and nobody reacts, that's the premise of Dead Kids, isn't it? The joke is the same. The difference is that one is fiction and the other isn't. And there are these moments, scattered throughout the series, where the show suddenly drops its casual approach and treats death seriously. Kenny dies is the obvious one, but there are smaller moments too. The ending of Raisins, Season 7, Episode 14, December 10th, 2003, where Butters is heartbroken over a girl and refuses to stop feeling sad because, as he puts it, he'd rather be sad than feel nothing at all. That's not about death exactly, but it's about the same thing. The choice between feeling pain and feeling nothing. And Butters chooses pain. And in a show that usually treats emotion as something to be laughed at, Butters quietly insists that feeling things, even terrible things, is better than the alternative. That might be one of the most important lines in the entire series, and it came from the character everyone treats as a joke. Let me talk about the show's censorship history more broadly, because the Muhammad episodes aren't the only pieces of South Park that have been altered, banned, or fought over. The show has been in a constant war with Comedy Central since its inception. Parker and Stone have described the network's Standards and Practices Department as adversarial, a group of people whose job is to tell them what they can't do. And for 30 years, that relationship has produced some of the show's darkest and most interesting episodes. The word shit was famously uncensored in It Hits the Fan, Season 5, Episode 1, June 20th, 2001, where the word is spoken 162 times. The episode was a direct response to the network's arbitrary rules about language, and it proved that the shock value of a word diminishes when it's repeated enough times. By the end of the episode, nobody cares about the word anymore. It's just a sound. And the episode made its point, that censorship draws attention to the very things it tries to suppress, with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The show has also been banned, or heavily censored, in multiple countries. In Sri Lanka, it was banned entirely due to the 200/201 storyline and its portrayal of religious figures. In the UK, Sky One banned the airing of Proper Condom Use, Season 5, Episode 7, due to its explicit sexual references. Various countries have censored individual episodes based on local sensitivities, and in every case, the censorship has only increased interest in the banned material. Forbidden South Park episodes have become a kind of internet currency, sought after and traded with a fervor that the episodes probably wouldn't generate if they were freely available. There's a dark lesson in that. Censorship makes things more powerful, not less. Every episode of South Park that's been banned has become more famous, more discussed, more culturally significant because of the ban. The darkness that society tried to contain has, by being contained, become darker. That's the paradox at the heart of the show's entire philosophy. Let me talk about something I haven't touched on yet, the show's treatment of addiction, because it's another thread of darkness that runs through the entire series. South Park has depicted addiction many times, and its approach has evolved significantly. In the early seasons, addiction was mostly played for laughs. Towely's obsession with getting high was a one-note joke that reduced substance abuse to a catchphrase. Don't forget to bring a towel. It was funny. It was also reductive. But as the series matured, its treatment of addiction deepened. Randy Marsh's alcoholism, which starts as a background gag in the early seasons, becomes a genuine character trait that the show takes increasingly seriously. In Bloody Mary, Season 9, Episode 14, December 7th, 2005, Randy attends Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and is told he has a disease. The episode satirizes the disease model of alcoholism, while also depicting the real consequences of Randy's drinking on his family. Stan has to drive his drunk father home from a bar. Sharon is humiliated. And the episode ends with Randy choosing to control his drinking on his own terms, rather than accepting the framework he's been given. That ending is deeply ambivalent. Is Randy demonstrating strength by rejecting the disease model? Or is he in denial? Is his decision to moderate rather than abstain a form of self-empowerment or self-deception? The episode doesn't answer these questions. It just presents them. And the uncertainty, the refusal to declare whether Randy is right or wrong, is what makes the episode's treatment of addiction so much more sophisticated than its earlier approach. The show has also dealt with addiction through Kenny's parents, whose substance abuse is a constant presence in the McCormick household, and through the town of South Park itself, which cycles through collective obsessions with the regularity of a clinical disorder. The adults of South Park get addicted to everything: Chin Pokemon, World of Warcraft, celebrity gossip, craft beer, weed. Each obsession follows the same pattern: initial enthusiasm, escalating commitment, destructive consequences, and eventual abandonment in favor of the next obsession. The town itself is an addict, cycling through highs and crashes with no self-awareness and no learning. And that pattern, the collective addiction cycle, is one of the show's most incisive observations about American culture. The way we latch onto trends and causes and controversies with an intensity that borders on mania, then drop them just as quickly when the next thing comes along. The way our attention is itself a form of addiction, always seeking the next hit, the next outrage, the next thing to care about, until we don't care about it anymore. The way we consume our own culture, the way an addict consumes their substance, compulsively, destructively, without pleasure. South Park has been running long enough to have watched this cycle play out in real time, dozens of times. And the show's awareness of the cycle, its ability to predict the next collective obsession, to satirize it as it's happening, then to watch it fade and be replaced, gives the show a kind of dark prophetic quality. It's not just commenting on culture, it's documenting the patterns of cultural addiction. And those patterns, when you see them clearly enough, are genuinely frightening, because they suggest that we're not in control, that the addiction is systemic, that the machine of cultural consumption is bigger than any individual choice, and that the only way to break free is to stop consuming entirely, which, in a media-saturated world, is effectively impossible. South Park is, ironically, part of that machine. It's a product of the same cultural consumption cycle it satirizes. People binge watch it on streaming platforms. They consume it as content. They scroll through clip compilations on YouTube. And they treat it as background noise, which is literally what these fall asleep to videos are designed for. And the darkness of that, the fact that a show about the toxicity of cultural consumption has itself become an object of cultural consumption, is a recursion that would make Cartman proud. I'm aware of it. You're aware of it. And yet here we are, 3 hours in, still listening, still consuming, still adding to the very pattern the show is warning us about. And the only honest thing I can do is acknowledge that contradiction and keep going, because that's what South Park does. It acknowledges the contradiction and keeps going. It says, yes, we're part of the problem. Yes, we profit from the very things we criticize. Yes, the darkness is inside us too, and we're going to keep making the show anyway. Because the alternative, silence, withdrawal, surrender, is worse. I think they're right about that. I think the flawed attempt is better than no attempt at all. I think the imperfect mirror is better than no mirror at all. And I think South Park, crude, offensive, brilliant, careless, tender, monstrous, hilarious South Park, is one of the most important cultural documents of the last 30 years, precisely because it's so imperfect, because it contains everything: the light and the dark, the jokes and the silence, the farts and the Fleetwood Mac, the construction paper kids, and the very real pain underneath. Let me mention one more episode that I think deserves to be part of this conversation, and then I really will start wrapping up. Best Friends Forever, Season 9, Episode 4, aired March 30th, 2005. Oh, this episode won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, one of only a handful of Emmys the show has won, despite 20+ nominations. And it won the Emmy because it did something remarkable. It aired on the exact same day that Terry Schiavo died. Terry Schiavo was a Florida woman who had been in a persistent vegetative state since 1990. Her husband wanted to remove her feeding tube. Her parents wanted to keep it in. The case became a national flashpoint about end-of-life care, government intervention in medical decisions, and the sanctity of life. It dominated the news cycle for weeks. And South Park, with its 6-day production cycle, was able to produce an episode about the controversy that aired on the very day the controversy reached its conclusion. Kenny is in a persistent vegetative state, kept alive by a feeding tube, while the town fights over whether to remove it. Cartman wants Kenny to die so he can inherit his PSP. A media circus erupts. The episode directly parallels the real-world case with such precision that viewers couldn't tell whether Parker and Stone had simply gotten lucky with the timing, or had deliberately structured the production schedule to coincide with the expected date of Schiavo's death. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The 6-day cycle allowed them to stay current, but the specificity of the parallels and the emotional intelligence with which the episode handles the ethical questions at its center suggests a level of planning and care that goes beyond mere speed. The episode asks genuine questions about life and death and the politics of both. It doesn't give easy answers. It uses Kenny, the character who dies every week, the character whose death is usually meaningless, as the vehicle for exploring what it means for death to actually matter. And the irony of that, using the show's most disposable character to examine the undisposable nature of human life, is one of the most sophisticated structural choices Parker and Stone have ever made. The Emmy win was deserved, and the fact that the episode aired on the day of Schiavo's death, connecting the fictional and the real in the most direct possible way, is one of those moments where South Park transcends its own form and becomes something closer to journalism. Real-time journalism, processed through comedy and construction paper, more honest than most of the actual journalism about the case. That's what the show does at its best. And it takes the things we can't face directly, death, cruelty, injustice, our own complicity, and filters them through a medium that lets us engage without being destroyed. The comedy is the anesthetic. The darkness is the surgery. And when it's over, something has been revealed that couldn't be revealed any other way. And you know what? Let me say one more thing before I bring this home, because I've spent 3 hours talking about darkness, and I want to make sure I haven't left you with the wrong impression. South Park is not a depressing show. I know that sounds strange after everything I've just said. After 3 hours of talking about child abuse and school shootings and banned episodes and psychological torture and existential despair. But I don't experience South Park as depressing, and I don't think you do either. Even if you're lying in bed right now thinking, God, this guy has been talking about some really heavy stuff. The reason South Park isn't depressing, despite being, as I've argued, one of the darkest shows on television, is that it's alive. It crackles with energy. It moves. It reacts. It cares. A depressing show would be one that had given up. A show that had stopped trying to make sense of the world. A show that had retreated into its own despair and stayed there. South Park has never done that. Not once in 30 years. Even in You're Getting Old, the most despairing episode the show has ever produced, there's an energy to the despair that keeps it from being nihilistic. Stan's cynicism isn't empty. It's full of frustration and disappointment and the betrayed expectation that the world should be better than it is. And that expectation, the belief that the world owes us something better, is paradoxically a form of hope. You can only be disappointed by a world you expected something from. You can only be cynical about things you once cared about. Cynicism is failed optimism, and failed optimism is still, at its core, optimism. That's what I hear underneath all of South Park's darkness. Optimism, angry, frustrated, foul-mouthed, construction paper optimism. The belief that if you point out what's wrong loudly enough, crudely enough, persistently enough, maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. Maybe someone will change. Maybe the darkness will recede by an inch. Maybe the room will fill back up. Maybe. South Park doesn't guarantee it. South Park never guarantees anything, but it keeps trying. Week after week, season after season, year after year. 2 guys from Colorado, pulling all-nighters, making a cartoon about 4 kids, in a town full of idiots, in a world that's going to hell. And the fact that they keep doing it. The fact that after nearly 30 years and 300 episodes and $900 million, and death threats and banned episodes and creative crises and a global pandemic, they still sit down on Thursday and start from scratch. That's not darkness. That's something else. Something I don't have a word for. Something between stubbornness and devotion and madness and love. And that something is why, despite everything, South Park makes me smile. Not the individual episodes, not the specific jokes. The fact of the show's existence. The fact that it endures. The fact that in a world that has given us every reason to give up, the two guys in a studio are still choosing every single week to engage. That's the real story of South Park, not the darkness, the refusal to be defeated by it. Let me talk about something that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, because I think it represents a kind of turning point for the show's darkness. When the pandemic hit in 2020, South Park couldn't produce its regular season. The 6-day production cycle required a team working in close proximity, and that wasn't possible during lockdowns. So instead of a traditional season, Parker and Stone produced a series of hour-long specials, starting with the Pandemic Special on September 30th, 2020. And these specials were different, darker, more sustained. The humor was still there, but there was a weight to the pandemic specials that felt new. The isolation, the uncertainty, and the creeping despair. Parker and Stone were processing a global catastrophe in real time, and you could feel it in every frame. South Park, post-COVID, which premiered on Paramount Plus on November 25th, 2021, took the darkness even further. It jumped 40 years into the future to show the boys as adults, living in a world that had been permanently altered by the pandemic. Stan was an alcoholic. Kyle lived alone. Kenny had become a scientist, working to find the cause of COVID-19. And Cartman, in what might be the show's most devastating character development, had converted to Judaism, married a Jewish woman, and was living a seemingly happy family life. The joke was clear. In the darkest timeline, Cartman's redemption is the most unbelievable thing of all. But then, in South Park, post-COVID, the return of COVID, December 16th, 2021, we learned that Cartman's conversion was a con, an elaborate long-term manipulation. He'd faked decades of religious devotion and family commitment as part of a scheme. And when the scheme was exposed, his wife and children were destroyed. Not physically, emotionally. Cartman had taken the deepest, most sacred bonds of family and faith and used them as tools in a grift. And in that moment, you realize what Parker and Stone have built over 25 years. They've built a character who can't be redeemed, who literally cannot change, who will twist anything, including love, including parenthood, including God, into a weapon. And the darkness of that isn't the cruelty itself, it's the hopelessness. It's the suggestion that some people are simply beyond saving, that some damage is permanent, that some darkness has no bottom. I need to linger here for a moment, because the post-COVID specials deserve more attention than they usually get in these kinds of discussions. They're not just dark episodes, they're a kind of dark thought experiment. What would happen if the show's reset button, the magical mechanism that restores everything to normal at the end of every episode, was permanently disabled? What would these characters become if they actually had to live with the consequences of everything that's happened to them? And the answers are devastating. Stan becomes an alcoholic whiskey reviewer, living alone in a dingy apartment, communicating with his old friends through video calls he can barely bring himself to make. The boy who was once South Park's moral center, the one who always wanted to do the right thing, and the one who cared, has become a man who can't care anymore. He drinks to numb the same cynicism that consumed him in You're Getting Old, except now there's no reset button. Now the cynicism is permanent. Now it's who he is. Kyle becomes a lawyer, which sounds respectable until you realize that he's become exactly the kind of person he spent his childhood fighting against. Bureaucratic, cautious, compromised. The boy who stood up to Cartman, who delivered moral speeches, who believed in justice. He's become a man who navigates systems instead of challenging them. The fire is gone. The outrage is gone. What's left is competence without passion, success without meaning. Kenny becomes a scientist, the only one of the four who seem to have found purpose. He's wealthy, he's working on something important, and then he dies. Again. But for real this time, killed by a time travel experiment that goes wrong. And the other characters mourn him, but there's something automatic about their grief. They've mourned Kenny so many times that the grief itself has become routine. Even in death, Kenny is invisible. Even in the future, nobody really sees him. And Cartman converts to Judaism, marries a Jewish woman, has Jewish children, runs a small-town church, is apparently, impossibly, happy. And every viewer knows, the way you know when a serial killer on a cop show is being too cooperative, that it's a lie, that the conversion is a con, that the family is a prop, that Cartman is playing the longest game of his life, and when the mask comes off, the destruction will be absolute, and it is. When Cartman's scheme is revealed, when his wife and children learn that their entire life has been a manipulation, the devastation is total, not violent, not dramatic, just the quiet, irreversible shattering of trust. The look on his wife's face when she realizes that the man she loved doesn't exist, that the father of her children is a fiction, that the faith she shared with him was a weapon he used against her. That scene haunts me, not because of what Cartman does. We've known what Cartman is capable of since Scott Tenorman Must Die, but because of what it says about the possibility of change. Because for a little while, for a few episodes, you almost believed it. You almost believed that Cartman could change, that love could redeem even the most broken person, that the show's most monstrous character might contain a seed of genuine humanity that just needed the right soil. And the show took that hope and destroyed it, methodically, completely, with the same precision that Cartman used to plan the chili con carne. And the message was clear. Some people don't change. Some people can't be saved. And the desire to believe otherwise, the hope that animates every story of redemption, is itself a vulnerability that people like Cartman will exploit. That is, without question, the most nihilistic thing South Park has ever said, and I don't know if I agree with it. I want to believe that people can change. I want to believe that redemption is possible. But South Park has spent 25 years building the case against that belief, and the post-COVID specials are the closing argument. I've been sitting with that idea for a while now, and I'm not sure I agree with it completely. I think South Park sometimes confuses cynicism with honesty. I think there are moments where the show's darkness crosses from insightful to nihilistic, from challenging to cruel, from meaningful to mean. But I also think that's the point. The show is supposed to be uncomfortable. It's supposed to make you argue with it. It's supposed to push you to the point where you have to decide for yourself where the line is. And that's maybe the darkest fact of all. South Park doesn't tell you where the line is. It just pushes past it and watches to see if you follow. Let me circle back to something I mentioned at the beginning. The background details. The small things. Because I think the darkest aspects of South Park live in the margins. In the things you only notice on your 5th or 10th or 20th rewatch. Like the fact that Craig Tucker flips people off constantly and nobody ever addresses it. It's just there. This 10-year-old boy's default response to the world is a middle finger, and the adults around him don't see it as a problem. That's a small darkness. A tiny indictment of how adults fail to engage with children's obvious distress signals. Or the fact that Tweek, the perpetually anxious, caffeine-addicted kid, is being fed coffee by his parents. His parents own a coffee shop, and they give their child excessive amounts of caffeine, which is why he shakes and screams and can't focus. His anxiety isn't innate. It's inflicted. His parents are literally poisoning him. And the show treats it as a quirky character trait. Or the fact that Mr. Mackey, the school counselor, is genuinely terrible at his job. Every time a child comes to him with a real problem, bullying, abuse, depression, existential crisis, Mackey responds with platitudes and dismissals. "Drugs are bad, McKay," is funny as a catchphrase. But in context, it's a portrait of institutional incompetence. The one person whose job is to protect these children's mental health is a well-meaning idiot who can't help anyone, and the kids know it. They never go to Mackey for real help. They've learned that the system doesn't work. These small details, these background darknesses, are, in some ways, more disturbing than the big, dramatic moments, because they're systemic. They're not aberrations. They're not one-time events. They're the constant, low-level failures of a society that doesn't care enough about its children to protect them. And they're played for laughs, which means we don't notice them, which means they're doing exactly what the show is satirizing, normalizing neglect. I want to talk about the show's treatment of mental health, because it's evolved significantly over the show's run, and that evolution itself tells a dark story. In the early seasons, mental health was mostly a punchline. Characters who displayed symptoms of mental illness were treated as weird or funny. The show didn't engage with psychology in any meaningful way. But as the series progressed, something shifted. Episodes started grappling with genuine psychological experiences. Stan's depression in You're Getting Old, and Asperger's, Butter's resilience in the face of abuse. E. Cartman's increasingly obvious personality disorder, Kyle's tendency to take on the emotional weight of every situation, Kenny's existential relationship with his own mortality. And then there are episodes like Tweek X Craig, Season 19, Episode 6, October 28th, 2015, which started as a joke about the boys being drawn into a yaoi relationship by Asian American artists, but evolved into a surprisingly tender story about two boys learning to communicate with each other. Or Put It Down, Season 21, Episode 2, September 20th, 2017, which dealt explicitly with suicide and Tweek's anxiety, and featured Craig learning how to support his partner through a mental health crisis. These episodes aren't dark in the way that Scott Tenorman Must Die is dark, but they're dark in a quieter way, in the way they acknowledge that these cartoon children are dealing with psychological weight that no child should have to carry. And the show, to its credit, doesn't always play these moments for laughs. Sometimes it just sits with the pain. Sometimes it lets a character be sad without making the sadness funny. And in those moments, you glimpse the show that South Park might have been if Parker and Stone had chosen tenderness over transgression more often. But they didn't choose tenderness. They chose transgression. And I think that choice, made consistently over 30 years, is itself a kind of darkness. Because every time the show has the opportunity to be kind and chooses to be cruel, every time it could comfort and instead challenges, every time it could reassure and instead disturbs, it's saying something about what its creators believe art is for. They believe art is for disruption, for provocation, for breaking things open and forcing people to look inside. And that's a valid artistic philosophy, maybe even a necessary one, but it comes at a cost. The cost is that South Park never rests. It never lets you be comfortable. It never lets you settle into the warm glow of a lesson learned or a problem solved. And after 30 years of that, after 30 years of being poked and prodded and challenged and made to laugh at things you probably shouldn't laugh at, you start to wonder, is there any rest at the center of this thing? Is there a quiet room somewhere in this show where the darkness stops and something peaceful begins? And I think there is. I think the quiet room is the friendship between the four boys. It's imperfect and sometimes cruel and often tested, but it's real. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, for all their dysfunction, for all the darkness that swirls around them, keep coming back to each other. They keep sitting at that bus stop. They keep walking to school together. They keep being friends, even when friendship is hard, even when the people around them fail them, even when the world is literally going to hell. And there's something genuinely beautiful about that. Something that I think Parker and Stone believe in, even if they'd never say it so directly. The idea that human connection persists, that even in the darkest timeline, even in a town where school shootings are background noise and children are abused by their parents and your best friend might feed you your own family, even in all of that, people reach for each other. People choose each other. People show up. That's the heartbeat underneath all the darkness. And it's what makes the darkness bearable. Not because it cancels it out, but because it exists alongside it. Light and dark. Comedy and tragedy. Fart jokes and Fleetwood Mac. That's South Park. That's always been South Park. And after nearly 30 years, I still haven't figured out how they pull it off. Let me talk about a few more dark facts before we start winding down, because there are things I haven't mentioned yet that I think deserve your attention. Then the show has killed off or removed several voice actors' characters in notably harsh ways beyond Chef. Mary Kay Bergman, who voiced many of the female characters in the show's early seasons, died by suicide on November 11th, 1999. She was only 38. She had voiced characters including Leanne Cartman, Sharon Marsh, Sheila Broflovsky, Wendy Testaberger, and many others. Her death was devastating to the production team, and she was replaced by Eliza Schneider and later April Stewart for most of the female roles. Parker and Stone dedicated the season 4 premiere to her memory. It's a reminder that behind the crude animation and the offensive jokes, there are real people making this show, and those people carry real grief. The show's relationship with Scientology extends beyond the Isaac Hayes controversy. Then the Church of Scientology allegedly conducted an investigation into Parker and Stone after Trapped in the Closet aired, attempting to find embarrassing information that could be used against them. Parker has said in interviews that private investigators followed them. Whether or not the church was directly responsible for this surveillance has never been definitively proven, but the story illustrates the real-world stakes of South Park's satire. This isn't just a cartoon making jokes. This is a cartoon that powerful organizations have tried to silence through intimidation. The show's portrayal of Tom Cruise in Trapped in the Closet led to a peculiar corporate battle. When the episode was scheduled for a rerun in 2006, it was pulled, allegedly, because Cruise, who was promoting Mission Impossible 3 for Paramount, owned by Viacom, the same parent company as Comedy Central at the time, threatened to withdraw from promotion if the episode aired. Parker and Stone responded by incorporating references to the controversy into later episodes, including a direct jab at Cruz in 200 and 201. And here's another dark fact that connects the show to the broader entertainment industry: South Park's deal with Paramount. In 2021, Parker and Stone signed a deal reportedly worth $900 million to continue making South Park through 2027, including new seasons and streaming specials for Paramount Plus. $900 million. For a show about construction paper children saying terrible things, that number isn't just large, it's a commentary in itself. It tells you exactly how valuable transgression is in the American entertainment market. Controversy sells. Darkness sells. And the very qualities that make South Park dangerous and difficult are the qualities that make it worth almost $1 billion. And there's something genuinely dark about that. About the idea that the most subversive show on television is also one of the most profitable. About the tension between artistic rebellion and corporate value. Parker and Stone have always been aware of this tension. They've satirized their own success multiple times. But awareness doesn't resolve it. They're millionaires many times over. They're part of the system they mock. And every dark joke they make, every sacred cow they slaughter, every line they cross, it all makes somebody richer, including them. Is that hypocrisy? I don't think so. I think it's just reality. Messy and contradictory and uncomfortable, like the show itself. Let me go deeper into something I touched on earlier, but didn't fully explore: the show's treatment of race. Because South Park's relationship with race is one of the most complicated and, yes, darkest aspects of its legacy. For most of the show's run, the character now known as Tolkien Black was called Token, a name that was, itself, a joke about tokenism in media. He was the only black kid in town. He was wealthy. He was well-spoken. And the joke, at least initially, was the irony of his name. The show was self-aware about its own tokenism and named the character accordingly. But over the decades, that self-awareness curdled into something more complicated. Cartman's racism toward Tolkien became a recurring source of comedy. Cartman assumes Tolkien can play bass because he's black, assumes he loves Tyler Perry movies, assumes he knows about every black cultural touchstone, and the show frames Cartman's racism as wrong. Stan and Kyle consistently push back against it, but it also keeps returning to it as a source of humor. And there's a tension there that the show has never fully resolved. Is the joke that racism is stupid? Or is the joke racism itself? Can you spend 20 years mining racist stereotypes for comedy and still claim the moral high ground by having other characters say it's wrong? In season 25, the show renamed the character from Token to Tolkien, revealing that his name had always been a reference to J.R.R. Tolkien, not to tokenism. It was a clever meta joke. The audience had been the ones making the wrong assumption all along, but it was also, in a way, a retcon, a rewriting of history. A show that had spent decades winking at its own tokenism suddenly denied that the wink had ever happened. I don't think South Park is a racist show. I think it's a show that uses racism as subject matter, and that the distinction matters. But I also think there are moments, scattered across 300 episodes, where the show's treatment of race crosses from satirical observation into something more careless, where the joke doesn't quite earn the discomfort it produces, where the dark comedy is a little more dark than comedy. And those moments are, I think, worth sitting with. Not to condemn the show, but to understand its limitations. Because every great work of art has limitations, and acknowledging them doesn't diminish the work. It deepens it. While I'm on the subject of the show's complicated legacies, let me talk about its treatment of transgender people. This is another area where the show's history is genuinely dark, not because of individual episodes, but because of the cumulative effect. In Season 9, Episode 1, Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, which aired March 9th, 2005, Mr. Garrison undergoes gender confirmation surgery. The episode includes actual stock footage of real surgical procedures. It equates Garrison's transition with Kyle wanting to become black and Gerald wanting to become a dolphin. The message was clear. Gender transition was presented as equivalent to any other form of body modification, and all of them were treated as absurd for years. And that episode, and the show's broader treatment of transgender characters, was cited by critics as one of the most harmful portrayals of transgender people in mainstream media. Not because it was the most explicitly hostile, but because it was the most widely seen. South Park reaches millions of viewers. Many of those viewers are young people forming their understanding of the world. And when one of the most popular shows on television consistently frames gender transition as a punchline, that has real-world consequences for real transgender people. Parker and Stone have not, to my knowledge, publicly apologized for or revised their position on these episodes. And the show continues to address gender identity in ways that many find problematic. And this is one of those areas where South Park's equal opportunity offender philosophy runs into a wall, because the consequences of mocking marginalized groups are not equal to the consequences of mocking powerful ones. Making fun of Tom Cruise or the Church of Scientology is punching up. Making fun of a transgender kid trying to survive middle school is something else. And I say this as someone who loves this show, who has spent 3 hours talking about why I think it's one of the most important things on television. But love doesn't mean uncritical acceptance. Love means caring enough to see the whole picture, including the parts that make you uncomfortable. Let me talk about something else entirely. Let me talk about the show's games. Because the South Park video games contain some of the darkest content the franchise has ever produced, and they often fly under the radar when people discuss the show's most disturbing moments. South Park: The Stick of Truth, released in March 2014, was developed by Obsidian Entertainment with direct involvement from Parker and Stone. It's an RPG set in the South Park universe, and it includes scenes that would never have made it to broadcast television. There's a level set inside Mr. Slave's body. There's a subplot involving alien anal probing that's far more graphic than anything in the show. There are boss fights against Nazi zombies and underpants gnomes, and the woodland critters make an appearance, performing blood rituals that make their animated counterpart look tame. But the darkest element of the Stick of Truth is also the subtlest. The game lets you play as a new kid in South Park, a blank slate onto whom the player projects themselves. And as you play, you discover that your character has been the subject of government experimentation. Your parents are in witness protection. Your entire life has been shaped by forces beyond your control. And the game's tone, despite its comedy, carries an undercurrent of sadness. You're a kid in South Park. Nobody is looking out for you. You're on your own. South Park: The Fractured But Whole, released in October 2017, went even further. It included a difficulty slider that, in one of the game's most talked about design choices, was tied to the character's race. Playing as a darker-skinned character made the game harder, not in gameplay terms, but in terms of how NPCs treated you. Cartman, upon seeing your character's race, comments on how much harder your life will be. It was a joke. It was also a commentary. And the fact that a video game, a medium associated with escapism and fantasy, forced players to confront racial inequality through a game mechanic. That's South Park. That's the show using every possible medium to make you uncomfortable with truths you'd rather ignore. Alright, I want to take us somewhere very specific now. Let me talk about an aspect of South Park's darkness that requires looking at the show from a production perspective that most fans never consider. The show has a writing room, not a large one. Parker is the dominant creative voice, but there are other writers and producers who contribute over the years. And these have included people like Bill Hader, who worked as a creative consultant and writer for several seasons. Hader, who went on to create and star in Barry, itself one of the darkest comedies in television history, has talked about his time at South Park, and what he's described sounds genuinely intense. Hader has said that working with Parker was like watching someone compose a symphony in real time, while the orchestra is already playing. The speed of the process, the pressure, the stakes, every week was a crisis. Every week they started with nothing and ended with a finished product that millions of people would watch. And the writing room was where the darkness was born, where someone would pitch an idea that seemed too extreme, and then Parker would find the angle that made it work, then the comedic framework that could contain the horror. There's a creative bravery in that process that I think deserves recognition, because writing dark comedy isn't just about being edgy. It's about understanding where the line between funny dark and just dark actually falls. It's about knowing when you've gone too far and when you haven't gone far enough. And South Park, over 30 years, has developed an almost preternatural instinct for that line. They cross it regularly. They cross it deliberately. But they almost always cross it in a way that reveals something true about the subject matter, rather than just shocking for the sake of shock. Almost always. Not always. And the times when they miss, the episodes that are genuinely mean without being insightful, that are dark without being illuminating, and that punch down instead of punching through, those episodes are instructive too, because they show you what the show looks like when the machinery fails. When the 6-day cycle produces something half-baked, when the instinct is off, and the darkness lands wrong. I think Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina is one of those episodes. I think some of the later Cartman vs. Kyle episodes veer into repetition without depth. I think the serialized seasons, 19 and 20, occasionally sacrificed insight for continuity. And I think it's important to say so, because the show's brilliance isn't diminished by acknowledging its failures. If anything, the failures make the successes more impressive. They remind you that what Parker and Stone do, find humanity in hideousness, find truth in transgression, find tenderness in territory where no other show would dare to go, isn't easy. It's not guaranteed. It's not automatic. It requires an act of creative courage that can fail, and sometimes does. But when it works, when the 6-day miracle produces an episode like You're Getting Old, or Scott Tenorman Must Die, or Britney's New Look, or Dead Kids, the result is something unlike anything else in the history of television. A crude little cartoon that makes you confront things about yourself and your world that you would rather not know. A show made of construction paper and bad words that somehow functions as a moral compass in a morally chaotic world. That's the paradox of South Park. The darkest show on television is also, in its own profane and offensive way, one of the most morally serious. And the darkness isn't the opposite of the moral seriousness. It's the vehicle for it. The darkness is how they get to the truth. And the truth, once you see it, can't be unseen. Let me tell you about one more pattern that runs through the show's darkest episodes, because I think it's the thread that ties everything together. Look at what happens to the children of South Park across the show's run. Not the individual incidents, not the specific episodes where specific bad things happen to specific kids. Look at the cumulative experience. Look at what it would be like to actually be a child in that town. You would have witnessed multiple school shootings, and nobody would have cared. Your school counselor would be useless. Your teachers would include a volatile, identity-shifting authority figure who changes gender, or political affiliation and personality at the drop of a hat. Your local police officer would be illiterate. Your mayor would be corrupt. Your town would be invaded by aliens, monsters, terrorists, and celebrity lawsuits on a regular basis. Your friend would die every other week and come back without explanation. Your other friend would be a genuine sociopath capable of murder. Your parents would be alcoholics, narcissists, or homicidal, depending on which set of parents you're talking about. And through all of this, you would be expected to go to school, do your homework, and behave. That's the darkest fact about South Park. Not any single episode, not any single moment. The fact that these children live in a perpetual nightmare and nobody acknowledges it. The fact that the show's reality is, in its exaggerated way, and not that far from the reality of a lot of real children. The fact that somewhere, right now, there's a kid living in a world that looks a lot like South Park. Chaotic, dangerous, indifferent, and nobody is coming to help. I keep coming back to something Butters said, not in a dark episode, in a relatively light one. Raisins, Season 7, Episode 14, December 10th, 2003. Butters has been dumped by a girl he liked, a Hooters-style waitress at a restaurant called Raisins, who was never actually his girlfriend. And at the end of the episode, when the other boys try to get him to join their goth phase and wallow in nihilism, Butters refuses. He says, and I'm going to try to capture the spirit of it without quoting directly, that he's sad, and that's okay. That being sad means you've felt something good, and you know what good feels like. And even though it hurts right now, the hurt is proof that the good was real. He'd rather feel the pain of loss than feel nothing at all. That speech, delivered by the most abused, most neglected, most dismissed character in the show, is one of the most beautiful things South Park has ever produced. And the fact that it comes from Butters, from the kid whose mother tried to drown him, whose father lies to him, whose grandmother beats him, whose classmates use him as a human shield, makes it devastating. Because if anyone has a right to be cynical, it's Butters. If anyone has a reason to go goth and declare that the world is meaningless, it's Butters, and he doesn't. He chooses to feel. He chooses to remain open. He chooses, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, to believe that the world contains good things worth experiencing. That's not naivety, that's courage. And it's the kind of courage that South Park, for all its cynicism and transgression and darkness, ultimately believes in. Underneath everything, underneath the fart jokes and the murdered parents and the school shootings and the banned episodes and the construction paper carnage, there's this small, stubborn belief that feeling things is better than not feeling things. That engagement is better than withdrawal. That even a world made of crap contains moments worth experiencing. And I think that's why we keep watching. Not for the darkness itself, for the tiny lights inside it. let me talk about a few more specific dark facts that I want to make sure I cover. Well, because some of these details are the kinds of things that change how you watch the show once you know them. Here's one that not many people know about. The episode Jared Has AIDS, Season 6, Episode 2, aired March 6th, 2002, was one of the first episodes produced after the 9/11 attacks. And while the episode's main plot involves Jared Fogle and weight loss, the subplot has Butters being brutally beaten by his parents. They think he's been misbehaving. They punch him. They hit him. His face is covered in bruises, and the show frames it as comedy. Less than 6 months after the most traumatic national event in a generation, South Park produced an episode in which a child is beaten by his parents, and it's presented as background humor. And the normalization of that violence, the fact that Butters getting beaten is treated as a B-plot that barely registers within the world of the show, is one of the most disturbing things about South Park's universe. Here's another one. In Cartman Land, Season 5, Episode 6, aired July 25th, 2001, Cartman inherits $1 million from his grandmother and uses it to buy his own theme park. Meanwhile, Kyle develops a hemorrhoid so severe it becomes life-threatening. And as Cartman's park succeeds, Kyle's condition worsens. As Cartman's park fails, Kyle improves. The implication is that Kyle's physical health is directly tied to whether justice is being served in the universe. When bad people are rewarded, good people suffer physically. That's a dark cosmology. And it's saying the universe isn't just indifferent, it's actively sadistic. And the darkest moment in the episode isn't the medical stuff. It's when Kyle, lying in his hospital bed, begins losing his faith in God. He whispers that maybe there's no justice. Maybe the bad guys just win, and the good guys just suffer, and there's no meaning behind any of it. He's 9 years old, having a crisis of faith triggered by his friend buying a theme park. That's South Park, existential despair, disguised as a story about a fat kid and a roller coaster. Let me talk about something that happened in the real world that most fans don't connect to the show, but that I think is one of the darkest contextual facts about South Park. On April 20th, 1999, the Columbine High School massacre took place in Littleton, Colorado. 12 students and 1 teacher were killed. 21 others were injured. It was, at the time, the deadliest school shooting in American history. Littleton, Colorado is roughly 90 miles from the real town of Fairplay, which served as partial inspiration for the fictional town of South Park. Trey Parker grew up in Conifer, Colorado, which is even closer, about 30 miles from Columbine. Matt Stone attended Heritage High School in Littleton itself, just a few miles away. When the massacre happened, they were already 2 seasons into making South Park. They were immediately asked whether their show bore any responsibility, whether a crude animated show about foul-mouthed children created an environment where violence was normalized. And the same questions being asked about Marilyn Manson and violent video games and every other piece of media that society decided to blame. And Parker and Stone's response was to make South Park bigger, longer, and uncut. The theatrical film released on June 30th, 1999, just 2 months after Columbine. The film is, among many other things, a direct response to the idea that media causes violence. Its central thesis is that blaming entertainment for societal problems is not just wrong, but actively dangerous. That the impulse to censor and control and blame is itself a form of violence against freedom of thought. The film was rated R. It contained 399 profane words, which set a Guinness World Record at the time. And it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song with Blame Canada. And its message, that scapegoating art is easier than addressing root causes, remains as relevant today as it was in 1999. Maybe more so. But here's the dark irony. The film's thesis was tested by reality almost immediately. When Dead Kids aired 19 years later, the episode about school shootings becoming normalized, the show had to confront the fact that its own response to Columbine hadn't changed anything. The scapegoating of media stopped. Yes, nobody seriously blames South Park for school shootings anymore, but the shootings didn't stop. The root causes were never addressed. And the show that insisted in 1999 that the real problem wasn't media, but society had to admit, in 2018, that society hadn't gotten any better. That's the burden South Park carries. The burden of being right and having it not matter. The burden of diagnosing the disease and watching the patient refuse treatment. The burden of satire in a world that's beyond satire. Let me also talk about Mr. Hanky for a moment, because the Mr. Hanky saga contains one of the show's most painfully timely storylines. In The Problem with Apu, Season 22, Episode 3, aired October 10th, 2018. Mr. Hanky, the beloved Christmas Pooh, faces cancellation for offensive social media posts. The episode is a transparent allegory for the cancel culture era. The town votes to banish Mr. Hanky, and he ends up being taken in by Springfield, a direct reference to The Simpsons, in one of the most meta gags the show has ever pulled, the Mr. The Hanky storyline was also widely read as Parker and Stone's commentary on their own position in the culture. They were well aware that some of their earlier episodes, the treatment of transgender people, the use of racial humor, the casual deployment of slurs, would not pass muster in the current cultural climate. Mr. Hanky being banished for his old posts was Parker and Stone acknowledging that they themselves might eventually be held accountable for things they said 20 years ago. It's preemptive self-critique that's very Parker and Stone. Acknowledging the critique before it arrives, making a joke out of it, and then letting the joke sit with you long enough that you start to wonder if it's actually a joke at all. Here's another dark fact about the show's longevity that carries its own kind of weight. The South Park has been running since 1997. The children are permanently 8 to 10 years old. They never age. They never grow up. They are frozen in childhood forever, while the world around them changes constantly. New technologies appear, cultural moments arrive and depart, presidents are elected, wars begin and end, and Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny remain the same age, sitting at the same bus stop, waiting for the same school bus, living the same childhood day after day. There's something genuinely unsettling about that when you sit with it. These characters are trapped. They exist in a perpetual present tense. They can never escape childhood. They can never grow up and leave South Park. They are condemned to experience the same phase of life with all its vulnerability, all its dependence on adults, all its exposure to forces beyond their control forever, and the audience ages around them. The people who watched the first episode in 1997 are now in their 40s and 50s. They've lived entire adult lives, careers, marriages, children of their own, while Stan and Kyle remain frozen at 10. And there's something melancholy about that relationship. We grew up, they didn't. We got to leave our childhoods behind. They never will. Parker and Stone are aware of this. You're getting old is the most explicit expression of it. Stan trying to grow up in a world that won't let him, but it's present throughout the show. The tension between the character's eternal childhood and the world's relentless progression is one of the show's deepest sources of darkness, because it's not just a narrative convention. It's a metaphor for something real, the part of us that never fully grows up, the child inside every adult who still feels overwhelmed and confused by a world that doesn't make sense. The child we carry with us everywhere, covered in an orange parka, voice muffled, face hidden, waiting for someone to notice. Let me tell you about one more weird, dark corner of South Park history. There's a continuity detail that runs through the entire series that most casual viewers don't notice. In the early seasons, you can occasionally spot Kenny's face, his actual face, without the parka hood, in background shots. This was intentional. The animators hid glimpses of Kenny's face as Easter eggs, and the face they gave him was ordinary, plain, unremarkable, just a kid. And there's something affecting about that. Big Kenny, the character defined by concealment, by muffled speech, by hidden identity, by anonymous death, has a face underneath it all, a normal kid's face, and you almost never see it. He goes through the entire series with his identity literally hidden, and the few times his face is shown, it's so unremarkable that you forget it immediately, which is the point. Kenny is the invisible child, the child nobody sees, the child whose death doesn't matter, the child whose poverty and suffering and endless cycles of dying and returning go unnoticed. And the hood, the parka that covers his face and muffles his voice, isn't just a character design choice. It's a metaphor. The invisibility of vulnerable children. The way society covers their faces and muffles their voices and goes about its business while they suffer. And Trey Parker based Kenny on a real kid he grew up with. A kid who wore an orange parka. A kid who was the poorest in the neighborhood. A kid who would disappear from school for days at a time. And Parker and his friends would joke that he'd died. A kid whose name was Kenny. I don't know what happened to the real Kenny, but the fact that this character, this emblem of invisible suffering, this walking metaphor for the disposability of poor children, was based on a real person adds a layer that I find genuinely moving, because it means South Park didn't invent its darkness. It observed it. It took the real cruelties of childhood, poverty, invisibility, indifference, and put them in a cartoon. And the cartoon made people laugh. And maybe, sometimes, the laughter opened a door to understanding. Let me talk about the show's treatment of religion briefly, because it's produced some genuinely dark and remarkable commentary. South Park treats religion the way it treats everything else, as fair game. Jesus Christ hosts a public access TV show. God has appeared as a small, strange-looking creature. Satan is a sympathetic character with relationship problems. Moses appears as a giant glowing dreidel. Buddha has been depicted snorting cocaine. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad became the center of the show's most dangerous controversy. But beneath the irreverence, there's genuine philosophical engagement. Red Hot Catholic Love, Season 6, Episode 8, July 3rd, 2002, tackled the Catholic Church's child abuse scandal before most mainstream outlets were willing to confront it head-on. The episode wasn't just taking cheap shots. It was asking real questions about institutional corruption, about the difference between faith and the organizations that claim to represent it, and all about Mormons. Season 7, Episode 12, November 19th, 2003. Did something remarkable. After spending the entire episode meticulously mocking the origin story of Mormonism, a Mormon kid named Gary delivers a speech telling Stan that even if the story of Joseph Smith sounds absurd, it gave his family values that made them better people. And then Gary tells Stan to go screw himself for being so judgmental. The audience is left in an uncomfortable position. They've spent 20 minutes laughing at this kid's religion, and now the kid has the moral high ground. The show laughed at faith and then argued that the laughter was the problem. Then that complexity, that refusal to settle into a simple position on complicated questions, is one of the darkest and most admirable things about South Park. It doesn't just mock. It mocks and then questions its own mockery. It satirizes and then asks whether satire is enough. It tears things down and then wonders whether building them back up might be harder and more important. And that self-questioning is what keeps the show from being nihilistic. South Park isn't nihilistic. Nihilism would be easier. Nihilism would mean nothing matters, and nothing deserves engagement. South Park believes that everything matters, and everything deserves engagement. Even the things it hates, even the things it mocks, even the things that threaten it with death. The darkness of the show isn't the darkness of meaninglessness. It's the darkness of meaning, the overwhelming, exhausting, sometimes terrifying weight of caring about a world that doesn't seem to care back. Let me talk about the video games one more time, because there's something about The Fractured But Whole that I glossed over. When that game was released in October 2017, it did something no other mainstream video game had done. It tied the character creation screen's difficulty slider to skin color. If you created a darker skinned character, the game became harder, not mechanically, but socially. NPCs treated you differently. Cartman, the game's quest giver, commented that your life was going to be tougher. The difficulty setting was, in Cartman's words, a reflection of real-world circumstances. It was a joke. It was a commentary. It was a deliberate provocation. And it forced millions of players to confront something that South Park has always been saying in different ways. The world is not fair. The experience of life is not equal. And the comfortable people who play video games for escapism don't usually have to think about that. But South Park is going to make them think about it anyway, right here, in the character creation screen, before the game even starts. That's the show's philosophy, compressed into a single game mechanic. You can't escape reality, not even in fiction, not even in a game. The darkness follows you, the unfairness follows you, and the only honest thing to do is to acknowledge it. Even if acknowledging it makes you uncomfortable, even if you came here to have fun, even if you paid $60 for a product that was supposed to entertain you, and instead it's making you think about systemic racism. That's South Park. That's always been South Park. The thing that makes you laugh until it makes you think. The thing that entertains you until it confronts you. The crude little cartoon that refuses to let you off the hook. Let me talk about the show's theme song one more time, because there's a detail I find oddly poignant. Les Claypool of Primus performed the iconic South Park theme. The lyrics were written by Parker and Stone, and the song, one of the most recognizable TV themes in the world, explicitly describes South Park as a pleasant, friendly place. The original version paints the town as somewhere nice to be. And the joke, of course, is that the town is the opposite of pleasant. It's a nightmare. It's a place where children die, adults fail, and the universe seems specifically designed to cause suffering. The theme song is a lie, a cheerful, bouncy lie that you hear every week before the horror begins. And after 30 years, you stop hearing the lie. You just hear the music. You tap your foot. You hum along. And then the episode starts and somebody gets fed their parents, or a child gets shot at school, or Butters gets grounded for existing. The gap between the theme song and the show is, itself, a kind of darkness. It's the gap between how we present ourselves and who we actually are. The gap between the story we tell about our society and the reality underneath. The gap that South Park has been excavating, episode by episode, for 3 decades. Okay, let me talk about one more element of the show that I think qualifies as genuinely dark. And it's not something that happens on screen. It's something about the audience. South Park has created a specific kind of viewer. A viewer who uses the show's worldview as a shield. You've met this person. Maybe you've been this person. The person who responds to any emotional or political argument with, "Dude, it's like South Park said." The person who uses the show's ironic detachment as permission to not care about anything. The person who thinks that because South Park mocks everything equally, nothing deserves to be taken seriously. Parker and Stone are aware of this. They've addressed it multiple times, most directly in the Man-Bear-Pig arc. In earlier seasons, Al Gore's warnings about Man-Bear-Pig, a transparent allegory for climate change, were treated as alarmist nonsense. Gore was the butt of the joke. The message was clear. Environmentalists are hystericists, and the real danger is taking them too seriously. Then, years later, Parker and Stone revisited Man-Bear-Pig, and this time, Man-Bear-Pig was real. He was destroying things. He was killing people. And the town of South Park had ignored the warnings for so long that it was too late to stop him without massive sacrifice. The show was, in effect, admitting it had been wrong. Admitting that the earlier episodes had been dismissive of a genuine threat. Admitting that its own reflexive both-sidesism had led it to trivialize something that deserved to be taken seriously. That's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen a television show do. Admitting its own mistakes, acknowledging that its earlier position was wrong, and doing so not in an interview or a press release, but in the show itself, through the same characters and the same comedy that had delivered the original wrong message. But here's the dark part. I'm not sure the correction reached the same people as the original message. The people who used the Man-Bear-Pig episodes to justify not caring about climate change probably didn't change their minds when the show reversed its position. They'd already absorbed the lesson they wanted to absorb. They'd already used South Park's irony as armor against engagement, and no amount of correction could undo that. That's the darkest thing about South Park's influence. Not the content of any specific episode. The way the show's worldview can be weaponized by an audience that takes the wrong lessons from it. The way irony and detachment and both sidesism can become excuses for apathy. The way a show that's fundamentally about engagement, about caring enough to be angry, to be sad, to be outraged, can be used to justify disengagement. And I don't think that's Parker and Stone's fault. I think they've done everything they can to push back against that reading. But art doesn't get to choose how it's consumed. Art doesn't get to pick its audience. And South Park, the most democratic show on television, the show that treats everyone the same, regardless of status or power, has to live with the fact that some of its viewers use its egalitarian mockery as permission to care about nothing. That's the final dark fact. Not about the show, about us, about what we do with the things we're given, about the gap between what art intends and what we take from it, about the unbridgeable distance between a creator's vision and an audience's interpretation. South Park tried to make us see. It tried to hold up a mirror. It tried to use darkness as a light, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. And the gap between those two outcomes, the gap between intention and impact, between truth and understanding, between a joke and its consequence, is the darkest territory of all. Let me tell you about one more dark story, and then I'll start bringing us home. In season 19, South Park underwent one of its most significant structural changes. The season, which premiered on September 16th in 2015, introduced serialized storytelling for the first time. Instead of standalone episodes, the entire season told a continuous story about political correctness, gentrification, and the nature of advertising. The PC principal character was introduced. The ads became sentient. The town of South Park was transformed. And here's what's dark about this. The serialization experiment didn't fully work. Seasons 19 and 20, which attempted to tell season-long arcs, are generally regarded as some of the show's weakest. The structure didn't suit the show's strengths. The topicality that makes South Park so immediate became a liability when stretched across an entire season, because the real-world events the show was satirizing kept changing faster than the season could adapt. Season 20, in particular, was decimated by the 2016 presidential election. Parker and Stone had written the season assuming Hillary Clinton would win. When Donald Trump won instead, the carefully constructed storylines collapsed. They had to rewrite on the fly, and the season suffered. The troll storyline became confused. The member berries metaphor lost coherence. The ending felt rushed and unsatisfying. And the dark fact buried inside this creative stumble is that the show's greatest strength, its ability to respond to reality in near real time, became its greatest weakness when reality itself became unpredictable. South Park couldn't keep up with the world. The 6-day cycle, which had always been the show's superpower, wasn't fast enough. Reality was moving faster than satire. Bill Parker said in an interview that they couldn't make fun of Trump because the real thing was already so absurd that satire couldn't top it. That's a remarkable admission from the creators of a show that has been topping the absurdity of reality for 3 decades. And it suggests something genuinely disturbing about the state of the world. When reality becomes indistinguishable from satire, satire loses its power. When the clown is already in charge, the comedian has nothing left to exaggerate. That's not just a South Park problem. That's a civilizational one. And the fact that South Park, of all shows, was the one to articulate it most clearly is, itself, a dark irony. Let me dig into the season 20 debacle more deeply, because I think it's one of the most instructive failures in the show's history. Season 20 premiered on September 14, 2016. It was fully serialized. Every episode was part of a continuous storyline. The season introduced a troll character named Skankhunt42, who was revealed to be Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's father, and dealt with themes of online harassment, gendered conflict, and the erosion of civil discourse. The member berries, a sentient fruit that whispered nostalgic catchphrases about how things used to be better, served as the season's central metaphor for the dangerous allure of nostalgia and regressive thinking. And it was all building toward the presidential election. The show had a Clinton victory built into the season arc. Mr. Garrison, who had become the show's Trump surrogate, was supposed to lose. The season's climax depended on it. Then, November 8th happened. Trump won. And the show's carefully constructed narrative collapsed. The episode that aired the night after the election, Oh Geez, Season 20, Episode 7, November 9th, 2016, was scrambled at the last minute. You can feel the seams. You can feel the panic. The writers were trying to pivot an entire season arc in 24 hours, and the result is an episode that feels like it was written by people in shock, because it was. Parker and Stone, like much of America, had not prepared for this outcome, and their show, which prides itself on responding to reality in real time, found itself unable to respond. The rest of Season 20 never fully recovered. Plot threads were abandoned. Character arcs were rushed. The member berries storyline dissolved into noise. And the season finale was, depending on your perspective, either a meta-commentary on the limitations of serialized storytelling or just a mess. I think it was both, and the mess is meaningful, because Season 20 is what happens when South Park's greatest strength, its ability to absorb and satirize reality in near real time, encounters a reality moving too fast and in directions too unexpected to be absorbed. The satirical machinery broke down, and the show, for the first time in its history, couldn't keep up. There's a darkness in that failure that goes beyond the show itself. If South Park, the most agile, responsive, fearless comedy on television, can be outpaced by reality, what hope does any satirist have? If the absurdity of the real world exceeds the capacity of the most absurd show on television to mirror it, what does that say about the world? Let me talk about the man-bear-pig situation in more detail, because it deserves a fuller treatment. In Season 10, Episode 6, Man Bear Pig, aired April 26th, 2006. Al Gore comes to South Park to warn everyone about Man Bear Pig, a creature that is half man, half bear, and half pig. The creature is obviously an allegory for climate change, and the episode treats Gore as a hysteric, a buffoon, a man so desperate for relevance after losing the 2000 presidential election that he's invented an imaginary threat. The episode was widely praised for its irreverence. South Park was doing what South Park does, mocking everyone, including the people who were right, because the show's philosophy has always been that everyone deserves to be mocked. But then reality intervened. Climate change got worse. The evidence became overwhelming, and the consequences became visible. And the Man Bear Pig episode which had been cited for years by climate skeptics as a pop cultural validation of their position, started to look less like equal opportunity satire and more like genuine denialism. In season 22, Nobody Got Cereal and Time to Get Cereal, episodes 7 and 8, aired November 7th and 14th, 2018. Parker and Stone revisited Man Bear Pig, and this time, Man Bear Pig was real, literally. He was destroying South Park. He was killing people, and the town had ignored the warnings for so long that there was no easy solution. The only way to stop Man Bear Pig was to sacrifice things the town loved, specifically soy sauce and Red Dead Redemption 2. And even then, the deal only lasted for a limited time. The episodes are remarkable. First, they're a direct admission that the show was wrong, not a vague, deniable admission, a specific, unmistakable correction. Man Bear Pig is real. He's dangerous. Al Gore was right. The people who mocked him, including the show itself, were wrong. Second, the episodes grapple with a genuinely dark question. What do you do when you've waited too long? When the damage is already done? When the solutions available are inadequate, and the sacrifices required are immense, and the future is compromised no matter what you do? The show doesn't have an answer. It just presents the question, and the question sits there, heavy and unanswerable. I think the Man Bear Pig correction is one of the most important things South Park has ever done. Not because it changed the show's politics, though it did, but because it demonstrated that the show is capable of growth, of admitting error, of looking at something it said 12 years ago and saying, we were wrong. In a media landscape where admitting wrongness is seen as weakness, where consistency is valued over accuracy, where doubling down is the default, South Park looked at its own past and said, that was a mistake. That takes courage, real courage. And the fact that it happened inside a crude cartoon only makes it more remarkable. Let me also touch on something about the show's fan community that adds another dimension to the darkness we've been discussing. South Park has one of the most devoted and analytical fan bases in television. These are people who maintain wikis with thousands of pages. People who track every background character, every hidden reference, every visual gag that appears for a fraction of a second. People who have mapped the geography of the fictional town, documented every one of Kenny's deaths, cataloged every time Cartman says something in a different language, and built timelines that reconcile contradictory episode details. And this obsessive attention to detail has revealed things that I don't think Parker and Stone necessarily intended to be noticed, like the fact that the backgrounds of certain episodes contain references to future plotlines, not as deliberate foreshadowing, but as recycled animation elements that happen to create meaning when placed in new contexts, or the fact that certain minor characters appear in the background of episodes that aired years apart. That creating an accidental continuity that fans have woven into elaborate theories about the true South Park timeline. The fan community has also preserved things the show's creators might prefer to forget. Every controversial joke, every questionable racial caricature, every moment that aged poorly, it's all cataloged, discussed, debated, and preserved. The internet never forgets, and the South Park fan community is the internet's memory at its most granular. This means that the show exists simultaneously in two forms. The version that airs on television, which moves forward constantly, always chasing the next week's news, and the version that exists in the fan archives, which is frozen, permanent, and accountable for everything it's ever said. And there's a darkness in that permanence, because South Park was designed to be disposable. It was designed to be made in 6 days, aired once, and forgotten. The construction paper aesthetic, the crude animation, the ripped from the headlines topicality, all of it was meant to be temporary, ephemeral, a joke you tell at a party and never tell again. But the internet made it permanent. The fan community made it archival, and now, every episode, including the ones Parker and Stone wish they could take back, exists forever, decontextualized from the moment of its creation, judged by standards that didn't exist when it was made. That's a form of darkness that applies to all long-running creative works. But it hits South Park especially hard because the show's whole identity is built on irreverence and transgression. A joke that was transgressive in 2001 might be merely offensive in 2024. A satire that was progressive in 2005 might seem regressive in 2020. And the show can't go back and edit its past. It can only move forward, carrying the weight of everything it's ever said, hoping that the new work is strong enough to recontextualize the old. Sometimes it is. The Man Bear Pig correction was strong enough. The Heidi Turner arc was strong enough. Dead Kids was strong enough. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the old work sits there, unchanged, uncorrected, uncomfortable. And the only honest response is to say, that's part of us too. We made that, we own it, and we've tried to grow. That's not a defense. It's not an excuse. It's just the truth. And South Park, for all its flaws, has always been more interested in truth than in comfort. Let me share a few more dark facts that I've been saving. Oh, because I think they work best clustered together near the end, when the weight of everything we've discussed gives them additional resonance. Did you know that the South Park movie's working title was South Park All Hell Breaks Loose? The MPAA rejected it because the word hell in the title would affect the rating. So Parker and Stone changed it to South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, which is obviously a crude joke. The most successful animated comedy film of 1999 has a title that's a sexual euphemism, and the MPAA approved it because they didn't catch it. Parker and Stone have described the MPAA battle as one of the most frustrating experiences of their careers. They went through multiple rounds of notes, each time being asked to remove specific jokes, and each time replacing the removed material with something equally or more offensive. The MPAA was playing whack-a-mole with crude jokes, and Parker and Stone had an unlimited supply of moles. Did you know that Parker and Stone's appearance at the 2000 Academy Awards, wearing dresses, having taken acid, nearly got them banned? They showed up in replicas of the dresses Jennifer Lopez and Gwyneth Paltrow had worn to previous ceremonies. They walked the red carpet, they were interviewed, and the entire time they were tripping. Stone has said in interviews that the acid didn't really kick in until they were inside the theater, and that by the time Blame Canada was performed by Robin Williams, the experience had become genuinely surreal. Though they didn't win, the award went to Phil Collins for You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan, and Parker has been openly sarcastic about the loss since. The Oscar loss became South Park content. Phil Collins appeared as a character in Timmy 2000, Season 4, Episode 3, April 19th, 2000, depicted as a sycophantic, award-obsessed musician. It was petty, it was funny, and it was a reminder that for Parker and Stone, everything, including their own professional disappointments, is material. Did you know that there's been at least one occasion where an episode was delivered to Comedy Central literally on the morning of broadcast, because Parker was still in the editing bay at 4 a.m.? Frank C. Agnoni II, the supervising producer, has described rushing master tapes to the Uplink facility with sometimes less than an hour to spare. In nearly 30 years, they've never missed a deadline. Not once. Did you know that Trey Parker has described the feeling of finishing an episode as physically similar to having a panic attack? After 6 days of escalating stress, the sudden absence of pressure creates a void that the body fills with chemical despair. Parker has compared it to post-performance depression, and then, the next Thursday, it starts all over again. I think about that when I watch the darker episodes, because there's a connection between the psychological toll of the process and the emotional honesty of the content. When Parker is sleep deprived and running on caffeine and creative adrenaline, the barriers between his conscious intentions and his deeper feelings thin out. The filters come off. And the result is sometimes the rawness of You're Getting Old. Content that feels like it came from somewhere unprotected. The 6-day cycle isn't just a production method, it's a creative philosophy. It says, don't think too much. Don't overthink. Trust your instincts. Go where the material takes you. And if that means going somewhere dark, darker than you intended, darker than the audience expects, then go there anyway, because the truth lives in the dark. I want to mention one more thing about the show's music. There's a detail I find oddly poignant. There's a recurring musical element that's darker and more subtle than the big songs. It's the generic, sad piano music that plays when characters are going through genuine distress. A simple melody, just a few notes, that shows up whenever something real is happening underneath the comedy. You hear it when Stan visits Kenny in the hospital, when Butters is alone in his room, when Kyle confronts the reality that Cartman will never change. And the fact that this music is generic, not a specific composition, but emotional shorthand, a melodic placeholder for sadness, is itself meaningful. It says that the show doesn't invest in its own sadness. It doesn't craft bespoke emotional landscapes for its dark moments. It uses the same simple, recycled melody, as if to say, yes, this is sad, we know, but we're not going to dwell on it. And that refusal to linger is part of what makes South Park's darkness so affecting. The sadness passes quickly, like Kenny's deaths, like Butter's punishments, like school shootings in America. Noted, and then the world moves on. That's the show's final, most devastating insight. Not that the world is dark, but that the darkness passes, that we acclimate to it, that horror becomes routine, that the thing that should break us becomes the thing we barely notice. And then one day, we're sitting in a supermarket, admiring the corn harvest, and we hear that a new celebrity is rising, and we start chanting along with everyone else, because fighting it is exhausting, and joining is easy, and the corn really does look good this year. Let me tell you one last thing, something I've been holding on to for the end. There's a moment in Kenny Dies, the episode where Kenny dies permanently for the first time, that I can't get out of my head. It's not the dramatic moments, not the speeches, not the funeral. It's a tiny detail. When Stan finally works up the courage to visit Kenny in the hospital, he walks in with a gift. He's been avoiding this visit for the entire episode because he can't handle seeing his friend dying. But he finally goes. He walks through the hospital doors. The nurses and doctors congratulate him for overcoming his fear. He walks down the corridor, holding his gift, and he enters Kenny's room. And the room is empty. The bed is unmade. The teddy bear that someone gave Kenny is on the floor, reaching toward the bed, as if it's trying to hold on to something that isn't there anymore. Stan is too late. Kenny is already dead. His last words were asking where Stan was. And that image, the empty bed, the fallen teddy bear, the gift that will never be given, is, I think, the darkest single frame in South Park's history. Darker than the chili, darker than the blood orgies, darker than the school shootings, because it's not shocking, it's not transgressive, it's not funny, it's just sad. It's just the terrible, ordinary reality of losing someone while you were still working up the courage to face them. We've all had that experience, or we will. The visit we didn't make, the call we didn't return, the conversation we were going to have tomorrow, except tomorrow came and the room was empty. And South Park, this crude, offensive, controversial, construction paper cartoon, captured that experience in a single frame with a bare mattress and a fallen teddy bear. No dialogue, no music, just empty space where love should have been. That's the darkness at the center of South Park. Not the spectacular cruelties, not the transgressive set pieces, the quiet, universal truth that we don't always get there in time. That the people we love slip away while we're still figuring out how to face them. That the rooms empty out whether we're ready or not. And the show goes on. Kenny comes back. The room fills up again. The status quo resets. But for one moment, in one episode, the show let the emptiness stay. It held the silence. It trusted us to sit with it. And that trust, the show's trust in its audience to handle the dark and the difficult and the genuinely sad, is maybe the most important thing about South Park. More important than the jokes. More important than the controversies. More important than the darkness itself. The trust that we can take it, that we're strong enough, that the darkness won't break us, and that we can look at the worst of what humanity is capable of, fed to us through construction paper and fart jokes, and come out the other side still believing that the world is worth engaging with. I think the show has earned that trust. I think we have too. Okay, I think I've taken us about as deep as we can go tonight, and I want to start bringing us back to the surface. Not with a grand statement or a dramatic conclusion, but with something small, something quiet, something to carry into sleep. I keep thinking about that bedroom. Stan's bedroom in You're Getting Old. The empty one. The one with the bare walls and the stripped mattress and the construction paper silence. I think that image is the truest thing South Park has ever created. Not the funniest, not the cleverest, not the most offensive or the most transgressive or the most culturally significant. Just the truest, because it captures something that every dark fact, every banned episode, every murdered character, every censored speech is ultimately about. The feeling of being alone in a room that used to be full. The feeling of looking at something familiar and not recognizing it anymore. The feeling of growing up, or growing old, or growing apart, or just growing, and realizing that growth doesn't always mean getting bigger. Sometimes it means getting emptier. South Park has been filling rooms for nearly 30 years, filling them with noise and color and outrage and laughter and darkness and light. And underneath all of that filling, there's always been this empty room, this quiet space where the show keeps its real feelings. Where Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two guys from Colorado who made a cartoon out of construction paper and somehow changed the world, sit with the things they can't joke about. I don't know what's in that room. I don't think they know either. But I think the show keeps going back there, episode after episode, season after season, because there's something in the emptiness that's worth visiting. Something honest, something true, something that can only exist in the silence between the jokes. If you're still here, if you've made it through 3 hours of darkness with me, I want to say thank you. Not the perfunctory kind of thank you, the real kind. Because listening to someone talk about the shadows inside a cartoon for 3 hours is an act of trust. And I don't take that lightly. I hope you found something in here that resonated. Something that made you think differently about a show you've watched 100 times. Something that made the darkness feel a little less dark, or a little more meaningful, or at least a little more understood. And if you're lying in bed right now, in your own room, with the lights off, and this playing in the background, I want you to know something. Your room isn't empty. Not really. It's full of all the stories you've ever heard, and all the laughter you've ever shared, and all the difficult things you've sat with and survived, including this one. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Share this with someone who loves South Park as much as you do, and leave a comment telling me which dark South Park fact surprised you the most, or which one I missed, because I definitely missed some. 3 hours isn't enough. It's never enough. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.